Hey there, tonight we're diving into the frosty world of Christmas in Stalin's Soviet Union, where the harsh reality was that holiday cheer had to be as secretive as a spy mission, complete with clandestine carols sung beneath the radar of the KGB. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. In the frosty grip of the early Soviet Union, Christmas was as welcome as a capitalist at a Bolshevik rally. The revolution had promised a clean slate, and that meant scrubbing away old traditions. Lenin and his comrades were all about the New World Order, and Christmas, with its twinkly lights and nativity scenes, didn't exactly scream workers' paradise. But why the holiday cold shoulder? It all boiled down to ideological purity, comrades. Religion was the opiate of the masses, according to Marx, and the Soviets were more into their 5-year plans than frankincense and myrrh. By the 1920s, the Soviet regime had made it official. Christmas was out, and the new year was in. The government wasn't about to let a little holiday cheer interfere with the grand socialist experiment. New Year's Eve, on the other hand, was a blank slate ripe for secular celebration. It was like swapping out Santa for a sternly worded memo from the Politburo. Goodbye, baby Jesus. Hello, Father Frost, or Dead Moraz, as he was known in the local lingo. Sure, he still had the beard and the jolly disposition, but he came bearing gifts of state-sanctioned joy, not religious reverence. The government didn't just ban Christmas. It waged a full-on propaganda war against it. Imagine trying to convince everyone that the holiday they loved was now a capitalist conspiracy. Posters plastered across the Soviet Union featured slogans warning against the perils of religious festivities. In schools, teachers were tasked with indoctrinating children in the new holiday order. If you think your office Secret Santa has too many rules, try navigating a holiday under Stalin. Even so, people weren't exactly rushing to toss out their Christmas trees. Despite the risk, many Soviet citizens clung to their traditions, celebrating in secret. After all, old habits die hard, and nothing makes a holiday tradition more appealing than a bit of subversion. It's like trying to diet during the holidays. Tell someone they can't have cookies, and suddenly they're craving a whole tray. The state was determined to fill the festive void with New Year's celebrations, complete with the glitzy facade of unity and progress. Grand parades, complete with floats and fireworks, were organized to showcase the Soviet spirit. These events were meticulously planned, with no expense spared. In a country where shortages were as common as snowflakes in Siberia, these displays were a spectacle of Soviet strength. Even the smallest towns were expected to participate, with local committees ensuring that every citizen knew their part in the state-sponsored merriment. Cultural shifts were orchestrated with the precision of a Tchaikovsky ballet. New Year's became the time for gift-giving, a clever way to repurpose the festive spirit into a socialist framework. The state-sponsored events were more than just parties. They were a demonstration of ideological conformity. Participation was both encouraged and expected, a subtle reminder that in the Soviet Union, even joy was a collective endeavor. Stalin's regime was nothing if not thorough. By the time the 1930s rolled around, the new year had firmly entrenched itself as the primary winter celebration. The transformation was driven not just by propaganda, but also by practical concerns. A secular holiday was easier to control, and it allowed the government to unify the diverse populations under a single banner. It was a masterclass in social engineering, turning a religious holiday into a state-sanctioned celebration of Soviet ideals. But let's not give the regime too much credit. Behind the glittering facade, the realities of life in the Soviet Union were grim. Food shortages, political purges, and forced collectivization were the real specters haunting the holiday season. The state might have been able to ban public celebrations of Christmas, but it couldn't erase the personal memories and traditions that people carried with them. For many, the Christmas ban was just one more thing to endure in a long list of hardships. In the end, the Soviet approach to Christmas was an exercise in irony. The more they tried to suppress it, the more people clung to their traditions, turning them into acts of quiet rebellion. It was a reminder that some things, like the human spirit, are harder to control than a parade route. State might have replaced Christmas with New Year's, but it couldn't entirely extinguish the light of the holiday from people's hearts. As with many things in Soviet history, the gap between official policy and personal reality was as wide as the Siberian steppe. While the Soviet state was busy trying to snuff out Christmas like an overzealous hall monitor with a water pistol, many citizens were busy playing a different tune, one that was slightly off-key, but full of festive spirit. The underground preservation of Christmas in the Soviet Union was a bit like trying to keep a pet alive in a school where animals were banned, a mix of ingenuity, defiance, and the occasional clandestine gathering. Let's talk about those secret Christmas gatherings. Picture this: a drab Moscow apartment, grey on the outside, but inside, a hidden sanctuary of holiday warmth. Families would quietly come together, whispers replacing carols, to celebrate a holiday that was as much about resistance as it was about religion. The risk of getting caught was as real as the Siberian winter, but that didn't stop determined grandmothers from sneaking in a few Christmas cookies. It was a game of cat and mouse, where the state was the cat, but the mice were particularly crafty. And where, you ask, did they get their supplies? Enter the black market, the unsung hero of Soviet holiday cheer. If you think finding a PlayStation 5 in 2020 was tough, try scoring a Christmas tree under Stalin. The black market was a bustling bazaar of forbidden delights, where one could procure everything from ornaments to contraband chocolates. Sure, you might have to trade a week's worth of bread rations or a favor from Uncle Yuri, but for many, it was worth it to have a little slice of Christmas under the radar. The economic context here was a tangled web of scarcity and ingenuity. The Soviet economy was as unpredictable as a snowstorm, with shortages and rationing being the norm. Officially, Christmas decorations were as non-existent as an honest politician, but unofficially they flourished in the shadows. A glass ornament might cost you a day's wages, but its value went beyond rubles. It was a symbol of defiance, a spark of joy in an otherwise grey existence. The risks involved in these secret celebrations were no laughing matter. Being caught with Christmas contraband could lead to a visit from the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, who were about as forgiving as a Siberian blizzard. Yet, the human spirit, much like a stubborn pine tree, finds a way to thrive even in harsh conditions. Soviets who celebrated Christmas did so with the knowledge that they were part of a quiet rebellion, a reminder that some traditions are worth preserving even when the cost is high. Now, let's not romanticize this underground Christmas too much. It wasn't all mulled wine and mistletoe. The reality was often a far cry from the idyllic holiday scenes we've come to expect. Imagine a Christmas dinner where the main course is cabbage soup and the dessert is a rare apple. Yet the laughter and camaraderie were as genuine as any holiday feast. These gatherings were a mix of nostalgia and survival, a way for people to maintain a connection to their past while navigating the uncertain waters of Soviet life. The resilience of the holiday spirit under authoritarian rule was a testament to the power of tradition. It was a quiet form of protest, a way to assert one's identity in a regime that sought to homogenize its citizens. Christmas, in its underground form, became a symbol of individuality and resistance, a reminder that not everything in life is subject to the whims of political power. As we delve deeper into the story of Christmas in the Soviet Union, it's clear that the holiday was more than just a day on the calendar. It was a battleground for cultural identity, a tug-of-war between state control and personal freedom. The preservation of Christmas traditions, despite the government's best efforts, highlights the indomitable nature of the human spirit, a spirit that refused to be extinguished, even in the darkest of times. In the next part, we'll peel back another layer of this complex history. We'll explore how these underground traditions evolved over time, adapting to the changing political landscape while retaining their core essence. Because if there's one thing we've learned so far, it's that Christmas, much like hope, is an enduring force, even when it's celebrated in the shadows. As the story of Christmas in the Soviet Union unfolds, it's time to pull back the curtain on the economic theater that played out behind this holiday drama. Picture the Soviet economy as a chaotic stage production, with Stalin as the director, barking orders from the wings. When Christmas got the boot and New Year's took center stage, the regime wasn't just making a cultural statement. It was also orchestrating an economic maneuver worthy of a 5-act opera. First up, let's talk about the redirection of resources. Imagine the Soviet Union as a grand chessboard, with every piece meticulously placed to advance the state's agenda. The act of banning Christmas wasn't just about ideological purity. It was also about reallocating resources to fuel state-approved events. While the idea of state-sponsored joy may sound like an oxymoron, it was a calculated move to showcase Soviet prowess. The regime allocated millions of rubles to fund lavish New Year's parades, complete with floats that would make Macy's blush and fireworks displays that lit up the bleak winter skies like a socialist Las Vegas. But here's the kicker. All this pomp and circumstance came at a cost, and the financial burden often trickled down to the everyday citizen. In a nation where bread lines were longer than a Tolstoy novel, the lavish spending on state celebrations was as much a spectacle as it was a source of resentment. Families already feeling the pinch from systemic shortages found themselves squeezed even tighter as the state redirected resources to these grand displays. Imagine standing in line for hours for a loaf of bread, only to watch your hard-earned tax rubles go up in smoke, literally, in the form of state-sanctioned fireworks. The ripple effect of banning Christmas reached far into the domestic sphere. For many Soviet families, the financial strain was akin to trying to squeeze a watermelon through a keyhole. With traditional holiday markets shut down, families had to rely on the black market for festive supplies, where prices soared higher than a Soviet space launch. A simple Christmas tree, for instance, might set you back a week's wages, while decorations, if you could find them, were priced like Fabergé eggs. This forced many families to make tough choices between celebrating in secret and putting food on the table. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. The financial realities were grim. The average monthly wage in the 1930s Soviet Union was around 200 rubles, barely enough to cover basic necessities. When you factor in the costs of clandestine Christmas celebrations, it's clear that the holiday spirit came with a hefty price tag. For many, these economic pressures turned the festive season into a survival challenge, where ingenuity was the only currency you could count on. But here's where the story takes an interesting twist. Despite the financial hardships, the suppression of Christmas didn't break the spirit of the people. It galvanized it. The economic strain became another layer of resistance, a test of endurance that many Soviet citizens faced with a mix of grit and dark humor. In a society where the state controlled everything from production quotas to personal beliefs, defying the Christmas ban was an act of economic rebellion as much as it was cultural. Public perception of the regime's holiday policies was as frosty as a Siberian winter. The lavish New Year's celebrations, while dazzling, were seen by many as a hollow display of power, a Potemkin village of prosperity that masked the harsh realities of daily life. It was like putting a fresh coat of paint on a crumbling facade, hoping no one would notice the cracks. The disconnect between the state's grandiose displays and the everyday struggles of Soviet citizens was as glaring as a neon sign in an empty street. And let's not forget the psychological toll. The suppression of Christmas added another layer of discontent to a population already burdened by economic uncertainty. For many, the holiday season became a time of reflection on what was lost, a sense of community, tradition, and personal freedom. It was a stark reminder that in the Soviet Union, even joy was a commodity controlled by the state. As we dive deeper into this historical tapestry, it's essential to recognize the resilience of the Soviet people. Despite the economic constraints and political pressures, they found ways to keep their traditions alive, turning adversity into a source of strength. The underground preservation of Christmas became a testament to the enduring power of culture and community, a quiet rebellion against a regime that sought to extinguish individual expression. In the grand scheme of Soviet history, the banning of Christmas was a microcosm of the broader struggle between state control and personal freedom. It highlighted the lengths to which the regime would go to maintain its grip on power, often at the expense of its citizens' well-being. But it also underscored the unyielding spirit of the people, who, despite the odds, refused to let go of their cherished traditions. As we continue this journey through the shadowy world of Soviet holiday history, it's clear that the story of Christmas is far from over. The economic impact of its suppression was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a complex interplay of politics, ideology, and human resilience. In the next part, we'll explore how these dynamics evolved over time, shedding light on the ways in which Soviet citizens navigated the ever-shifting landscape of state policies and personal freedoms. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the human spirit is as indomitable as it is unpredictable, always finding a way to shine through the darkest of times. Now, as we dive into the Soviet Union's attempt to swap out Christmas for a New Year's bonanza, it's like watching someone try to replace a beloved classic with a clunky reboot. The Soviet leadership, in its infinite wisdom, thought it could redefine what the holiday season meant for millions. They envisioned a future where New Year's Eve became the socialist showstopper, eclipsing all traces of tinsel and tradition tied to Christmas. But how did this grand plan fare? Did the New Year's spectacle manage to capture the hearts of the people, or did it merely paper over the cracks of a fading facade? Let's start by setting the scene. The year is 1935, and Stalin's regime is rolling out New Year's celebrations with all the fanfare of a state funeral, only with slightly more confetti. The government's plan was simple: turn New Year's into a cultural cornerstone, complete with parades, parties, and presents. Father Frost, the Soviet version of Santa Claus, was trotted out as the jolly face of this state-sanctioned revelry. But while he was supposed to bring gifts of socialist cheer, he was more like an awkward dinner guest nobody really invited. Now, according to some state records, because you know the Soviet Union loved its paperwork, New Year's was intended to be a holiday of unity, reflecting the nation's collective achievements. Official documents from the time reveal that the regime dedicated substantial resources to these celebrations, with entire committees assigned to oversee every detail. Yet, despite the grand plans, the reality was more like a mismatched jigsaw puzzle. The lavish parades may have dazzled onlookers, but in the harsh light of day, they couldn't hide the everyday struggles that defined Soviet life. Public reception. Well, if we're talking about applause, it was more of a polite golf clap than a standing ovation. According to a 1937 survey conducted by the Commissariat of Enlightenment, yes, that was a thing. Many citizens viewed these New Year's celebrations as a government-imposed charade. The state's efforts to promote New Year's as a time of joy and reflection often felt hollow against the backdrop of political purges and economic hardship. Imagine trying to party while holding your breath. Many citizens were just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And here's where the myth-busting comes in. While New Year's was indeed embraced by many, it was never quite the replacement for Christmas that the regime hoped it would be. A 1940 article in the Soviet press openly admitted that despite the state's efforts, old traditions were proving stubbornly resilient. Families continued to gather in secret, whispering carols like contraband poetry, with children sneaking peeks at hidden nativity scenes. The New Year's festivities, for all their pomp, couldn't erase the cultural memory of Christmas. It was like trying to convince people that tofu tastes like turkey. But why did this cultural tug-of-war persist? The answer lies in the human need for continuity and connection. Holidays aren't just dates on a calendar. They're woven into the fabric of personal and communal identity. The state underestimated the depths of this attachment, thinking that a shiny new holiday could simply replace centuries of tradition. Yet, as many Soviet citizens demonstrated, culture is a bit like a stubborn weed. It finds ways to sprout in the most unlikely places. The New Year's celebrations, while grand, often lacked authenticity. They were orchestrated with military precision, designed to showcase Soviet strength and unity. But beneath the surface, there was a sense of disconnect. Primary sources from the time, such as letters and diaries, reveal a population caught between the desire to conform and the yearning for genuine celebration. Many citizens participated in the state-sponsored events out of obligation rather than enthusiasm, a nod to the ever-present specter of state surveillance. Still, it's not all gloom and doom. The Soviet New Year's did evolve into a beloved tradition in its own right, albeit one tinged with irony. Over time, it became a unique blend of state propaganda and genuine festivity, a time when even the most cynical could let their guard down. if only for a night. The fireworks, the communal toasts, the shared laughter, these elements transcended political agendas, offering a brief respite from the rigors of Soviet life. Yet, despite the regime's best efforts, the New Year's celebrations never fully erased the shadow of Christmas. Instead, they existed side by side, each representing a different facet of Soviet identity. New Year's was the public face, the sanctioned celebration of collective achievements. Christmas, though banished, remained in the private sphere, a quiet reminder of personal faith and familial bonds. It was a duality that many Soviets navigated with a wry pragmatism, understanding that true joy often lay in the spaces between state edicts and personal expression. As we continue this exploration, it's clear that the Soviet Union's attempt to replace Christmas with New Year's was a microcosm of its broader struggle to control cultural identity. Regime's efforts to reshape holiday traditions reveal the complexities of power and resistance, highlighting the lengths to which people will go to preserve their sense of self. And while the state may have succeeded in creating a new holiday tradition, it could never fully extinguish the spirit of the old. In our next journey through this fascinating historical landscape, we'll delve into how these competing traditions evolved alongside the shifting political winds of the Soviet Union. We'll explore how the resilience of cultural memory continued to shape the lives of Soviet citizens, revealing the enduring power of tradition in even the most challenging of circumstances. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that while governments can dictate the terms of public life, the heart's true celebrations remain defiantly private, thriving in the most unexpected of ways. And so, as the story of Soviet holiday traditions continues to unfold, we're left with a tapestry woven from threads of cultural resilience and political maneuvering. What began as a state-led attempt to erase Christmas and elevate New Year's into a socialist extravaganza evolved into something far more complex and a lot more human. Fast forward to the post-Stalin era, and you'll find the Soviet Union engaged in what can only be described as a holiday balancing act. Khrushchev, with his infamous shoe-banging flair, led a regime less inclined to the heavy-handed suppression of traditions, but still keen on maintaining the ideological upper hand. The thaw in political repression saw a slow revival of Christmas celebrations, albeit behind closed doors and away from the prying eyes of government officials who still had an aversion to tinsel. In modern Russia, the legacy of these Soviet holiday policies is akin to a mixed bag of festive goodies. On one hand, New Year's remains the undisputed king of winter celebrations, a legacy of state-sponsored pageantry that successfully embedded itself into the national psyche. On the other hand, Christmas has staged a quiet comeback, reclaiming its spot on the holiday calendar, albeit with a distinctly Russian twist. Celebrated on January 7th, thanks to the Russian Orthodox Church's adherence to the Julian calendar, it's a reminder that some traditions, like stubborn weeds, find a way to flourish despite decades of attempts to uproot them. But let's not gloss over the irony here. The very traditions introduced as political tools, like the New Year's tree, once a thinly disguised Christmas tree, have become cherished parts of Russian culture. Father Frost, that jolly old mascot of socialist cheer, now shares the stage with Santa Claus, illustrating a cultural synthesis that blends the new with the old. It's a reminder that culture, much like the human spirit, is adept at cherry-picking the best bits from whatever history throws its way. Consider the economic context of this evolution. In the post-Soviet era, Russia's embrace of market capitalism brought with it a commercialized holiday season, complete with all the trimmings. Suddenly, the scarcity of the Soviet years gave way to an abundance of imported decorations, gift options, and holiday fare. The New Year's celebrations, once a state-controlled spectacle, transformed into a consumer-driven fiesta, a far cry from the breadline realities of the past. The irony here is thick enough to spread on toast. A holiday once used to showcase socialist unity now underpins a capitalist bonanza. But it's not all about economic shifts and consumer culture. The social fabric of modern Russia reflects a unique blend of past and present influences. According to a 2020 survey by the Levada Center, over 60% of Russians now celebrate Christmas in some form, a testament to the enduring power of tradition. Yet, New Year's remains the holiday heavyweight, with nearly 90% of Russians participating in its festivities. It's a duality that speaks volumes about the country's complex relationship with its past, a dance between the imposed and the inherited, the official and the personal. The broader implications of these holiday dynamics are as fascinating as they are revealing. They highlight the resilience of cultural identity, even under regimes that sought to homogenize and control. The Soviet Union's attempt to dictate holiday celebrations was a microcosm of its broader struggle to define what it meant to be Soviet. Yet, as history has shown, the human spirit is remarkably adept at sidestepping such constraints, finding joy in unexpected places, and weaving new traditions from the threads of the past. What's particularly striking about this historical journey is how it underscores the enduring power of cultural memory. Despite the Soviet regime's best efforts to mold traditions to fit its ideological framework, the essence of these holidays, community, family, and personal reflection, remained largely intact. It's a reminder that while governments can legislate many things, they can't legislate what people hold in their hearts. As we wrap up this exploration of Soviet holiday policies and their lasting impacts, let's take a moment to consider the broader legacy. The story of Christmas and New Year's in Russia is not just a tale of political intrigue and cultural resilience. It's a testament to the adaptability of human traditions. It illustrates how people, when faced with the absurdities of political mandates, find ways to preserve what matters most, often with a healthy dose of dark humor and ingenuity. In the end, the Soviet Union's holiday saga is a story of transformation and continuity, a reminder that while the pages of history are filled with attempts to control, redefine, and reshape, the human spirit is a force unto itself. It adapts, evolves, and endures, often in the most unexpected ways. So next time you find yourself caught between the allure of a state-sponsored celebration and the quiet joy of a personal tradition, remember this. History, much like the holidays, is what we make of it, an intricate dance between the past we inherit and the future we forge. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man who gave us the Great Wall of China, was the kind of leader who made historical waves with the subtlety of a meteor strike. Around 221 BC, while the rest of the world was trying to figure out how not to fall off a horse, Qin was busy unifying China with a flair for grandiosity that would make even the most ambitious modern CEOs blush. Now, this wasn't just any wall. It was the mother of all walls. Picture this, a massive stone and earth snake stretching over 13,000 miles, about half the circumference of the planet. But before you ponder the logistics of ancient construction, let's talk about the man behind the madness. Qin Shi Huang was the first emperor of a unified China, and he had a penchant for immortality projects. The wall was just one of them, a physical manifestation of his desire to keep the nomadic Xingnu tribes at bay, and let's face it, to show off a bit. But why, you ask, a wall? Well, this wasn't just any era in China. It was a time when making a decent wheel was still a technological feat, yet Qin was out there defying the odds. It was the 3rd century BC, a time when the Mediterranean world was busy with philosophers and the occasional tactical genius. But in China, Qin had other plans. The idea was simple. If you can't stop them, block them. The Xingnu were the boogeymen of Qin's time, and the solution was an architectural behemoth. The construction itself was no small feat either. It was a grueling endeavor that required the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers. According to historical records, which are about as reliable as a politician's promise, it's estimated that at least 300,000 soldiers and conscripted laborers were involved in the building process. Imagine being drafted into a project with zero safety gear and a work-life balance that involved a lot more work than life. These laborers were mostly peasants, soldiers, and prisoners, and they weren't exactly volunteering for Employee of the Month awards. Many perished under harsh conditions, leading to the grim nickname of the wall as the longest cemetery on Earth. Economically, the wall was a drain on the empire's resources. Qin Shi Huang's administration poured untold amounts of wealth into this project, which was about as practical as building a moat around your house in the desert. The financial burden was immense. The emperor's obsession with fortification strained the state coffers, leading to heavy taxation and financial strain for the citizens. But here's the kicker. For all its grandeur, the wall didn't exactly stop invasions. The Xingnu were like the house guests who keep finding ways to crash the party, wall or no wall. Politically, the wall was as much about keeping people in as keeping others out. It was a bold statement of power, an announcement to the world that China was a force to be reckoned with. In Qin's eyes, the wall was a symbol of his unyielding authority and a testament to his vision of a fortified empire. Yet, this vision came at the cost of widespread resentment. Harsh labor laws and forced conscription turned many a peasant against their ruler. You could say that the wall built more than just a physical barrier. It constructed a legacy of fear and control, overshadowed by the emperor's iron fist. In the grand scheme of things, the Great Wall was more than just a protective measure. It was a colossal PR stunt, a shout from the rooftops, or rather, the ramparts, that Qin Shi Huang was a ruler who wouldn't be trifled with. However, the wall's legacy is a mixed bag. On one hand, it represents the ingenuity and perseverance of an ancient civilization. On the other, it stands as a reminder of the dark side of absolute power and the human cost of imperial ambition. So, what's the takeaway? While it's easy to get caught up in the romantic ideal of a wall stretching across the rolling hills of China, it's crucial to remember the reality was often as harsh as the terrain it traversed. Behind the legend of the Great Wall lies a story of ambition, oppression, and the relentless pursuit of a legacy that would outlast its creator. Qin Shi Huang may have been a visionary, but his vision was built on the backs of those who had little choice but to comply. And that, dear friends, is why history isn't just about dates and names. It's about understanding the complex tapestry of human endeavor with all its triumphs and tragedies. Now, let's dig into the nitty-gritty of how the Great Wall was built, because, spoiler alert, it wasn't with love and enthusiasm. Picture a construction site where OSHA would have a meltdown. No safety harnesses, no hard hats, and definitely no brakes for kombucha. We're talking about an ancient assembly line powered by sheer will and a touch of despair. Construction techniques were as varied as the terrain. In the mountains, they used stone, while in the plains, they relied on tamped earth, a method that sounds like a medieval Pilates class, but involved packing soil and gravel into molds. The result? A structure as solid as the emperor's ego. And while we're on the subject of ego, let's not forget that some parts of the wall had to be rebuilt or reinforced over time, kind of like an ancient version of a software update. But let's talk about the real muscle behind the operation, the human labor force. This was no merry band of jolly workers whistling while they worked. The workforce was a mixed bag of conscripted soldiers, peasants, and prisoners, all thrown into the grinder of imperial ambition. Estimates suggest that up to 1 million people could have been involved at different times. That's right, about the same number of folks who attend a major sports event today, only with considerably less cheering. The conditions? Brutal doesn't even begin to cover it. Imagine working long hours in extreme weather conditions, with the constant threat of disease and exhaustion hovering like a bad smell. Food was scarce, and the work was dangerous enough to make modern office complaints about the AC being too cold seem downright trivial. Mortality rates were so high that some sections of the wall were rumored to be built with the bones of the very workers who died constructing it. Hence, the grim nickname, the longest cemetery on Earth. Now, you might be thinking, surely they were building something noble, something to protect their homeland. Ah, the romantic ideal of the noble endeavor. But let's not kid ourselves. This was less about protecting the empire and more about exerting control and showcasing power. The Great Wall was as much about keeping people in as it was about keeping others out. It was a monument to the emperor's paranoia and a tool for political propaganda. The Xingnu might have been the boogeyman, but the real monster was the relentless pursuit of a legacy, no matter the cost, and that cost was staggering. The construction of the wall drained the empire's resources like a leaky faucet nobody bothered to fix. The financial burden was immense, leading to heavy taxation that made the citizens grumble louder than a malfunctioning karaoke machine. Many families were left destitute, and the social fabric of the time was stretched thin, much like your holiday budget after a shopping spree. So why didn't the workers just quit? Well, in an age where refusing a royal decree wasn't exactly an option, the concept of quiet quitting didn't exist. Failure to comply could mean punishment, imprisonment, or worse. It was an era when the phrase, "take this job and shove it," would likely result in a swift shove off a cliff. Yet despite these harsh realities, the myth of the Great Wall as a noble venture persists. Perhaps it's the allure of the sheer scale, or the human fascination with epic undertakings. But behind the romance lies a darker truth. The wall was a testament not just to human ingenuity, but also to human suffering. It stands as a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked and ambition overrides empathy. In the grand tale of the Great Wall, the workers were the unsung heroes, the ones who transformed an emperor's grandiose dream into reality. They labored and perished, leaving behind a legacy carved into the very stones they hauled. Their story is one of resilience and endurance, but also a cautionary tale about the cost of greatness, one paid in blood, sweat, and lives. As we continue to peel back the layers of history, it's essential to remember that every stone laid was a testament to human tenacity and imperial ambition. The wall wasn't just a barrier against invaders. It was a colossal reminder of the lengths to which leaders will go to immortalize themselves. So, while we marvel at the Great Wall today, let's not forget the real story it tells, a saga of power, sacrifice, and the enduring human spirit. Stay tuned as we explore more of this monumental legacy, unraveling the intricate web of history and revealing the truths that lie beneath the stones. Now, let's dive into the real meat of the matter. Did this colossal wall actually serve its purported purpose of defending the Chinese realm? Spoiler alert. The answer is as layered as a millefeuille, deliciously complex, and not quite what it seems on the surface. The Great Wall, for all its intimidating length and legendary status, was less a fortress and more a flex, a massive stone flex, if you will. First, let's tackle the strategic rationale. The Great Wall wasn't some linear bastion of defense. In fact, it was more like a sprawling network of walls, watchtowers, and fortifications that varied in thickness and materials depending on the region. Some parts of the wall were as thick as 30 feet, while others were thin enough to make any medieval engineer wince. The strategic idea was to create a series of barriers that would slow down invaders long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Sounds great in theory, right? But in practice, these barriers were only as effective as the people guarding them. And let's just say the guards weren't exactly living the high life. The Xiongnu and later nomadic groups weren't deterred by the wall so much as they were mildly inconvenienced. They found ways to breach, bypass, or even bribe their way through the defenses. It's like trying to stop a river with a sieve. Sure, you might catch some water, but the rest is slipping right through. This isn't to say the wall was useless. It did provide a line of defense and a means of monitoring movement along the borders. But as a foolproof defense, let's just say it was about as foolproof as a chocolate teapot. Now, onto the political motivations. The wall was as much about optics as it was about security. Qin Shi Huang and subsequent emperors used it as a symbol of strength and unity, a monumental do not disturb sign to the rest of the world. This wasn't just a wall. It was an imperial Instagram post, a declaration of look at what we can do. It projected an image of an empire so powerful that it could bend nature to its will. And let's be honest, there's something inherently appealing about the idea of a giant wall snaking across the landscape, visible from miles away. It's the kind of thing that makes for great stories, even if the reality was a bit more, shall we say, porous. Propaganda played a massive role here. The Great Wall was a visual manifestation of the emperor's authority, a grandiose statement that China was not just a collection of warring states, but a unified empire with a singular identity. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a psychological one, designed to bolster the confidence of the people while intimidating potential adversaries. It was less about keeping the barbarians out and more about keeping the empire in line. The wall also served a more insidious purpose. It was a tool for controlling the population. By conscripting vast numbers of workers and soldiers, the emperors ensured that the populace was too busy hauling stones to contemplate rebellion. It was a classic case of bread and circuses, minus the bread, and with a lot more heavy lifting. By keeping the people occupied, the emperor could maintain control and suppress dissent. After all, nothing quells a rebellious spirit quite like back-breaking labor in the middle of nowhere. But let's not forget the economic angle. The construction and maintenance of the wall were a financial black hole. It sucked resources like a vacuum cleaner on turbo mode, diverting funds from agriculture, trade, and other essential sectors. The wall's upkeep required a steady supply of materials, labor, and manpower, which meant that the empire's economy was perpetually stretched thin. Heavy taxation was imposed on the citizens to fund this behemoth, leading to widespread dissatisfaction and, in some cases, outright rebellion. The legacy of the Great Wall is a paradox. On one hand, it stands as a testament to human ingenuity and the ability to dream big, really big. On the other, it highlights the darker side of ambition, where the pursuit of glory often comes at a staggering human cost. The wall may have been an architectural marvel, but it was also a monument to the excesses of power and the lengths to which leaders will go to secure their legacy. As we continue to unravel this historical tapestry, it's essential to remember that history is not a static narrative, but a dynamic interplay of motives, ambitions, and consequences. The Great Wall is more than just stones and mortar. It's a reflection of an era, a time when the line between power and paranoia was often as thin as the walls themselves. So, while we admire the grandeur of the Great Wall today, let's also acknowledge the complex realities that lie beneath its storied surface. And as we ponder the political and strategic chess game of ancient China, remember that the Great Wall was not just about keeping invaders at bay. It was about projecting an image, shaping perceptions, and controlling the narrative. The real battleground was not just the physical realm, but the hearts and minds of the people. In the end, the wall was a stage, and the drama of imperial ambition played out against its vast backdrop, a tale as old as time, with lessons that resonate even today. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the saga of the Great Wall, exploring how this monumental undertaking evolved over the centuries and what it reveals about the enduring human quest for security, power, and identity. But let's not get too comfortable with the idea that the Great Wall was a static monument built in one go. Oh no, this behemoth was more of a historical relay race, with each dynasty grabbing the baton and sprinting, or stumbling, toward the finish line. The wall we know today is less a singular feat and more a patchwork quilt of imperial aspirations, each dynasty stitching its own pattern of bricks and labor woes onto the fabric of Chinese history. First up, after Qin Shi Huang's initial grand gesture, the Han dynasty decided to double down on this whole let's build a massive wall concept. The Han, ruling from around 206 BC to 220 AD, were the ones who really took the wall idea and ran with it. They expanded it like a caffeinated city planner with a budget surplus. Under Emperor Wu, the Han added significant mileage, stretching the wall further north to counter the pesky Xingnu. The materials, mostly rammed earth and gravel, which, while not exactly state-of-the-art, were perfect for the time and terrain. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of using duct tape, cheap, effective, and everywhere. The Han weren't just about size, though. They introduced beacon towers and garrison stations, turning the wall into a veritable communication highway. Smoke signals and beacon fires lit up the skies, a kind of ancient Morse code alerting the Empire to incoming threats. It was the Instagram of its day, fast, effective, and occasionally set off by accident. Economically, though, the Han dynasty's wall-building spree was like trying to fund a space program with a lemonade stand. The costs were enormous, placing a heavy burden on the peasants who paid the taxes and, more often than not, provided the labor. It's hard to feel patriotic when you're being conscripted to haul dirt for months on end, especially when the Xingnu just found another gap in the wall. But such was the price of empire building, literally. Fast forward to the Northern Wei dynasty in the 5th century, and we see another burst of wall enthusiasm. The Wei, ruling a fragmented northern China, took a more defensive stance, fortifying sections with stone and bricks, materials that were harder to come by but offered greater durability. The result was a sturdier wall, though still not impenetrable. Picture trying to plug a leaky boat with gold-plated patches. It looks impressive, but water, the Xingnu, in this case, still finds a way in. The Sui dynasty, in their brief but ambitious run from 581 to 618, also saw the wall as their ticket to greatness. They repaired and extended it, focusing on the sections that protected vital trade routes like the Silk Road. This was less about military might and more about economic control, ensuring the empire's coffers overflowed with taxes from merchants. But the Sui, always the overachievers, bit off more than they could chew. Their ambitious projects, canals, walls, grand palaces, strained resources to the breaking point, leading to widespread revolts and ultimately their downfall. It's the classic tale of biding the imperial hand that feeds you. Then came the Tang dynasty, who ruled from 618 to 907 and decided to take a breather on the whole wall thing. They preferred diplomacy and trade, fostering relationships with nomadic tribes rather than building barriers. The Tang were the cool kids at the lunch table, opting for alliances over animosity. But this didn't mean they completely ignored the wall. They maintained it where necessary, ensuring it was still a viable defensive line if needed. Their approach was more about balance, maintaining a safety net without letting it choke the economy. The Song dynasty, ruling from 960 to 1279, faced different challenges. They had their hands full with the Jurchen and the Kittens, and later the Mongols. Instead of focusing exclusively on the wall, they invested in military technology, like catapults and gunpowder. The wall became less relevant in an era when warfare was evolving beyond bricks and mortar. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the knife is 13,000 miles long, and the gunfight involves Genghis Khan. Speaking of Genghis Khan, the Yuan dynasty, established by his grandson Kublai Khan, had little need for the wall. The Mongols, being the quintessential nomads, saw no point in maintaining a barrier they themselves had easily bypassed. Under their rule, the wall fell into disrepair, a relic of past dynasties' paranoia more than a practical tool for the present. Then came the Ming dynasty, who took one look at the tattered old wall and said, "Hold my rice wine." The Ming, ruling from 1368 to 1644, embarked on the most ambitious wall renovation project yet. They rebuilt large sections with bricks and stones, creating the iconic image we have today. This was the wall's golden age, an era of formidable fortifications, complete with watchtowers every half-mile. The Ming Wall was less about expansion and more about consolidation, a reminder that sometimes the best offense is a really, really intimidating defense. But here's the kicker. For all the Ming's efforts, the wall never really stopped anyone determined enough to breach it. The Manchu, founders of the Qing dynasty, simply went around it, proving once again that a wall is only as good as the strategy behind it. Ming's obsession with fortification had drained the treasury and stretched their military thin, leaving them vulnerable to internal strife and external threats. Throughout this never-ending cycle of build, repair, and rebuild, one constant remained: the economic strain. Each dynasty poured resources into the wall like it was a bottomless pit. The cost of labor, materials, and maintenance was a constant drag on an empire's finances. Heavy taxation and forced labor were the norm, fueling discontent and rebellion. The wall, while impressive, was an economic albatross, hanging around the neck of every dynasty that dared to tackle it. In the end, the Great Wall is a testament not just to human ingenuity, but to the folly of unchecked ambition. It's a symbol of the lengths to which empires will go to project power, often at the expense of their own people. And while it stands as a marvel of ancient engineering, it's also a reminder that bigger isn't always better. Sometimes, the most enduring legacy is one built on understanding and adaptation, not just bricks and mortar. So, as we pause our journey along the Great Wall, let's remember that this monumental structure is more than just a defensive line. It's a tapestry of human history, woven with threads of ambition, resilience, and the ever-present struggle for power. And as we've seen, the wall may have been a grand statement, but the real story lies in the lives of those who built it, maintained it, and lived in its shadow. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the legacy of the Great Wall, exploring the final chapters of its epic saga. And here we are, standing at the precipice of the Great Wall's legacy, a massive stone monument that stretches beyond mere geography and into the realms of myth and legend. In modern times, the Great Wall of China holds the allure of a world wonder, a must-see for tourists and a symbol of ancient ingenuity. But how much of that is rooted in reality, and how much is a carefully crafted narrative that's as much a product of imagination as the wall itself? Let's start with one of the most persistent myths, that you can see the Great Wall from space. Spoiler alert, you can't. Sorry to burst your bubble, but the truth is, seeing the Great Wall from the moon is about as plausible as spotting a hair strand from across the room. Even from low Earth orbit, you need perfect conditions and a lot of luck. Astronauts have confirmed that the wall is almost impassable to discern without aid, as its color and material blend into the surrounding landscape. So, if you find yourself in space, maybe focus on Earth's continents rather than squinting for a wall that's not much wider than a highway. Now, onto its cultural significance. The Great Wall has become iconic, synonymous with China itself, a symbol of resilience and strength. It's the kind of thing that makes for great tourist brochures and patriotic pride. But let's take a moment to reflect on why exactly this wall has become such a cultural touchstone. For centuries, it was a physical manifestation of China's attempts to define and defend itself against external and internal threats. Yet, over time, it also became a symbol of isolationism, a sign of an empire that chose to turn inward. The wall's original intent was strategic and militaristic, but today it serves as a reminder of the complex balance between openness and seclusion, a theme as relevant now as it was back then. Fast forward to 1987, when the Great Wall was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. This was a significant nod to its historical importance, but also a recognition of its cultural symbolism. However, it's worth noting that the Great Wall wasn't always viewed with such reverence. For many years, parts of it lay in ruins, neglected by locals who saw it as a source of building materials rather than a national treasure. It wasn't until the 20th century that the wall began its transformation from a relic of past ambitions to a cherished emblem of cultural heritage. This shift in perception mirrors China's own journey of self-discovery and modernization, a nation that, like the wall, has had to adapt to survive. Economically, the wall has transitioned from a financial sinkhole to a cash cow, drawing millions of visitors each year. Roughly 10 million tourists trek along its battlements annually, pumping significant revenue into the local economy. It's a stark contrast to the wall's ancient role as an economic drain, showing just how narratives can change over time. From a symbol of imperial excess to a contributor to modern prosperity, the wall's role in China's economy has come full circle. But let's not forget the human cost, the sacrifices of those who labored and died to make this monumental structure a reality. It's easy to romanticize the wall as a testament to human achievement, but behind every stone lies a story of hardship and toil. The Great Wall is often viewed through rose-tinted glasses, its sheer scale overshadowing the grim realities of its construction. It's a reminder that every grand vision has a price, often paid by those who have no say in the matter. The wall stands as a monument to ambition and the lengths to which people will go to leave a mark on history. In the end, the Great Wall is a paradox, a symbol of both unity and division. It represents the dichotomy of human nature, the drive to build something lasting and the tendency to isolate ourselves from perceived threats. It's a structure that has stood the test of time, not because of its impenetrability, but because of its ability to evolve with the changing tides of history. While it may not have been the impenetrable fortress ancient emperors envisioned, it has become something far more enduring, a testament to the complexities of human endeavor. As history tends to do, the Great Wall has been romanticized, its failures glossed over in favor of a narrative that fits our desire for epic tales. But in examining its legacy, we're reminded of the importance of looking beyond the myths and understanding the true costs and motivations behind such monumental undertakings. The Great Wall is more than just a series of stones stacked high. It's a reflection of the human condition, our dreams, our fears, and our undeniable drive to leave something behind. So, as we wrap up our journey through the history of the Great Wall, let's take a moment to appreciate both the grandeur and the grit, the legend and the reality. It's a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry woven with the threads of human ambition and resilience. The Great Wall may stand as a testament to the past, but its lessons are timeless, a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature and the eternal dance between power and humility. On May 19, 1925, in a city known for its steak, and oddly enough, hosting the Greatest Showman's circus, Omaha, Nebraska welcomed a baby named Malcolm Little into its world. If the universe had a sense of humor, and let's admit it, it often does, it decided to place Malcolm at the crossroads of chaos and courage right from the start. His father, Earl Little, was a big man with big ideas, a preacher by trade, and a Garveyite by conviction, which was basically like walking around with a "kick me" sign in 1920s America. Earl's admiration for Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement wasn't exactly a hit among the clan, and the little family had to pack up and skedaddle more times than a travelling salesman with a bad product. Let's talk about the Littles' frequent flyer miles. Not that they actually flew, mind you. This was the era when wheels were the preferred mode of escape from racial hostility. The little family relocated to Milwaukee, then to Lansing, Michigan, a place where their welcome was as warm as a Michigan winter. The local clan, not known for their hospitality, torched their home in 1929, the kind of housewarming gift nobody wants. Earl Little's insistence on justice and self-reliance made him a marked man, and his eventual death in 1931 was as suspicious as a fox in the henhouse. Officially ruled a streetcar accident, many believed it was more murder than mishap, but justice was as elusive as a cat in a dog park. Now, if you think Malcolm's life took a turn for the better after that, think again. The economic realities of the Great Depression hit hard, and the welfare system was about as forgiving as a grumpy librarian shushing rowdy kids. After Earl's death, the family was left with nothing but the Great Depression's version of a consolation prize: poverty. Malcolm's mother, Louise, struggled to keep the family afloat, working odd jobs and relying on sporadic public assistance. Unfortunately, racial biases in the welfare system meant that help was inconsistent at best. Malcolm's childhood was a carousel of instability, with the music playing a grim tune. The family was eventually split up by social services, a move that was supposed to be for their own good, but felt more like a forced game of hide and seek. Malcolm ended up in a foster home, where he learned quickly that life wasn't going to hand him any silver spoons. His foster parents were decent enough, but they might as well have been from Mars for all they understood about his background and the racial tensions he faced. School was another battleground where young Malcolm had to fight. He was bright, but his teachers had a knack for steering minority students away from ambitious dreams like lawyers or doctors. One teacher even suggested Malcolm consider carpentry, which, while a respectable trade, wasn't quite what Malcolm had in mind for his future. It was like suggesting Picasso try his hand at paint by numbers. Despite the discouragement, Malcolm was a sponge for knowledge, devouring books and absorbing information like a human vacuum. But the more he learned, the more he realized the cards were stacked against him. His early experiences with racism and economic hardship were the kind of life lessons that don't come with a diploma, but are worth their weight in wisdom. They planted the seeds of doubt and defiance that would later grow into his unyielding voice for change. So here we have young Malcolm, a child of Omaha, a witness to tragedy, and a student of life's harsh realities. His early years were a masterclass in resilience, setting the stage for a life that would be anything but ordinary. If the world thought it could keep Malcolm Little under its thumb, it was sorely mistaken. This was just the beginning of a journey where every twist and turn would shape a man who refused to be defined by his circumstances. And so, with a childhood marked by enough turbulence to make a hurricane look like a gentle breeze, Malcolm Little found himself at the cusp of adolescence, ready to take on the world, or at least give it a run for its money. Fast forward to the 1940s, and our young protagonist is strutting through the streets of Boston with a swagger that could rival any Hollywood leading man. Here, Malcolm adopted the moniker Detroit Red, a nod to his reddish hair and a hint at the rebellious persona he was crafting. But let's not get carried away thinking he was just a charming rogue. He was also knee-deep in a life of petty crime and hustling. Boston, with its bustling jazz clubs and vibrant nightlife, was the perfect backdrop for a young man looking to make his mark, even if that mark was more of a smudge on society's face. Malcolm navigated the jazz joints and pool halls with the panache of a seasoned player, even if his game often involved more sleight of hand than skill. But it wasn't all glitz and glamour. This was also an era where racial tensions simmered under the surface like a pot just waiting to boil over. The economic landscape was dicey too, with World War II end bringing a mix of hope and uncertainty. Jobs were scarce, especially for black men, and the opportunities that did exist were often the kind that made you question your life choices. In the midst of this economic and social stew, Malcolm's escapades escalated. His criminal activities were a mix of the sophisticated and the absurd, a real-life version of a heist movie written by someone who'd seen one too many episodes of a crime drama. His ventures took him from Boston to Harlem, where he found a kindred spirit in the chaos of the streets. Harlem, with its rich cultural tapestry and vibrant community, was a place where Malcolm could both lose himself and find himself anew. It was also where he tangled with the law enough times to make the Keystone Cops look like Scotland Yard. But let's take a moment to appreciate the irony of his eventual arrest in 1946. Picture this, a heist gone wrong, where the grand prize was a wristwatch and a couple of zoot suits. Hardly the haul you'd expect from someone who's supposed to be a master criminal. This slapstick saga was the result of a burglary gone awry, leading to Malcolm's capture and a subsequent sentence of 8 to 10 years in a Massachusetts state prison. Not exactly the great escape, was it? Now, you might think prison would be the end of the story, but for Malcolm, it was more like the beginning of a new chapter. It was here, behind bars, that he met John Bembry, a fellow inmate with a penchant for philosophy and a library card that seemed to be the key to unlocking Malcolm's mind. Bembry saw in Malcolm a thirst for knowledge that couldn't be quenched by the usual prison fare. And so, Malcolm began to devour books with the ravenous hunger of a man who'd been starved of the truth for far too long. This literary binge was complemented by his introduction to the Nation of Islam, a movement that would shape and define his future. The Nation, founded by Walis Fard Muhammad in the 1930s, was led by Elijah Muhammad during Malcolm's incarceration. It preached a message of black empowerment and self-reliance, a tune that resonated with the beat of Malcolm's own heart. The teachings of the Nation offered a framework through which Malcolm could channel his anger and frustration into something constructive. It was less about the fire and brimstone and more about building a community that could stand up to the societal forces arrayed against it. The transformation from Detroit Red to Malcolm X was as dramatic as it was profound. The X symbolized the unknown, a rejection of the little surname given to his ancestors by slave owners. It was a declaration of independence and a nod to the lost identity of his African heritage. This was a metamorphosis that turned a streetwise hustler into a man on a mission, a crusader not just for himself, but for a greater cause. Of course, Nation of Islam's teachings weren't without their controversies. Critics pointed to its separatist ideology and questioned its more extreme tenets. But for Malcolm, the appeal lay in its promise of dignity and self-worth, something that had been denied to him and countless others for far too long. It was a message that spoke to the heart of the economic and social issues facing black Americans, offering a path forward in a world that often seemed determined to leave them behind. As Malcolm's prison sentence dragged on, his reputation within the nation grew. He emerged as a powerful orator, someone who could captivate an audience not just with his words, but with the intensity of his conviction. His time in prison was as much about internal growth as it was about outward transformation, a period where he honed his ability to speak truth to power and challenge the status quo. And so, as Malcolm prepared to step back into the world, he did so not as a man defeated by his circumstances, but as one reborn. The stage was set for a new era, one where Malcolm X would become a household name, a symbol of defiance and change. But that's a story for another time, as we leave our protagonist ready to embark on the next phase of his remarkable journey. As Malcolm stepped out of prison in 1952, he wasn't just a free man. He was a man on fire, and not the kind of fire you put out with a bucket of water. We're talking the kind that lights up a room and makes people sit up and listen. The Nation of Islam had given him a new name, a new mission, and a new lease on life. It was like Malcolm had been handed the keys to the kingdom, and he was ready to unlock some serious change. By now, Malcolm was no ordinary convert. He was a man possessed by the urgency of his message and the power of his voice. He quickly rose through the ranks of the Nation of Islam, becoming a national spokesperson alongside Elijah Muhammad. And oh boy, did he have a way with words. It wasn't just about the content of his speeches, which were loaded with calls for black empowerment and self-reliance, but the delivery. If his speeches were music, they'd be a symphony of passion and precision, each note resonating with his audience. Malcolm was the kind of speaker who could make a simple room feel like an arena. His oratory skills were so sharp, they could cut through the din of indifference like a hot knife through butter. His speeches drew thousands, filling halls with eager listeners hanging on his every word. This was the man who could turn a simple phrase into a rallying cry, who could transform anger into action. According to some accounts, his speeches attracted as many as 25,000 new members to the Nation of Islam. That's more than just filling seats, it's setting the stage for a movement. But let's not ignore the elephant in the room. Malcolm's statements weren't just thought-provoking, they were downright controversial. His rhetoric was fiery, unapologetically challenging the status quo and calling out the systemic racism that had kept black Americans underfoot for far too long. He wasn't about to mince words, and that made him both a hero and a villain, depending on whom you asked. Critics accused him of preaching hate, of fanning the flames of racial division. But for many, he was a voice of necessary defiance, a man who wasn't afraid to say what others only dared whisper. Now, let's address the myth that Malcolm X was a solitary figure in the Nation of Islam, acting solely on the whims of Elijah Muhammad. While it's true that Malcolm revered Elijah as a mentor, the relationship was not without its complexities. Think of it less as a straightforward teacher-student dynamic and more like a Shakespearean drama, full of intrigue and underlying tensions. Elijah Muhammad was the face of the organization, but it was Malcolm's voice that gave it power and reach. Malcolm's charisma drew people in, and his intellectual vigor kept them there. The reality was that Malcolm and Elijah didn't always see eye to eye. Malcolm's rise to prominence brought with it a degree of autonomy that sometimes rubbed Elijah the wrong way. The internal dynamics were as intricate as a Swiss watch, and just as prone to malfunction. It's said that Elijah grew wary of Malcolm's growing influence, fearing that his protege might eclipse him. The tensions simmered beneath the surface, a subplot that would eventually boil over in dramatic fashion. Meanwhile, Malcolm was busy making waves outside the nation too. His speeches weren't just confined to the faithful, they resonated with a broader audience. In the tumultuous socio-political climate of the 1950s and 60s, Malcolm's voice was a clarion call for justice. He spoke at universities, public forums, and rallies, addressing issues that were as pressing as they were polarizing. While Martin Luther King Jr. preached integration and nonviolence, Malcolm offered a more militant vision, one that was less about turning the other cheek and more about standing one's ground. This wasn't just a difference in strategy, it was a fundamental divergence in philosophy. Malcolm's speeches were often raw and uncompromising. He spoke of the ballot or the bullet, a phrase that encapsulated the urgency of black suffrage and the potential for violent resistance if change wasn't forthcoming. This wasn't just incendiary rhetoric. It was a reflection of the frustrations boiling over in black communities across America. The economic realities of the time were grim, with unemployment rates for black Americans double those of their white counterparts, and housing discrimination as pervasive as spam emails today. In this context, Malcolm's words weren't just radical, they were revolutionary. But let's not forget that Malcolm was a man of evolution. His views weren't static, and he wasn't afraid to re-evaluate his stance. As he traveled and grew, he began to question some of the nation's more dogmatic beliefs. His pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, for example, was a turning point. There, he witnessed a racial harmony that challenged his previous perceptions. He returned with a new perspective, one that embraced a more inclusive vision of racial solidarity. This wasn't a 180-degree turn, but it was certainly a shift, one that hinted at the complexity of Malcolm's character. The myth that Malcolm X was a one-dimensional figure defined solely by his early rhetoric does him a disservice. Here was a man who was willing to adapt, to learn from his experiences, and to broaden his worldview. This evolution, however, was not without its costs. His growing distance from the Nation of Islam's orthodox line put him at odds with Elijah Muhammad and other leaders within the organization. The internal conflicts were as charged as a live wire, and Malcolm found himself increasingly isolated. In 1963, tensions reached a boiling point when Malcolm made a controversial comment about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, referring to it as a case of chickens coming home to roost. The backlash was swift, and Elijah Muhammad silenced Malcolm for 90 days. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a clear signal that Malcolm's rising star was seen as a threat to the established order. The internal strife was a house of cards on the verge of collapse, and Malcolm was left to pick up the pieces. The silence didn't last long, though. Malcolm returned with renewed vigor, breaking away from the Nation of Islam to form his own organizations, Muslim Mask, Inc., and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. This was a new chapter, one that allowed Malcolm to explore his evolving beliefs and engage with a broader audience. It was a bold move, one that signaled his determination to carve out a space for himself on the national stage. As we leave Malcolm at this juncture, it's clear that his story is far from over. The stage is set for the next act, one where Malcolm X continues to challenge, inspire, and redefine the boundaries of activism. His journey is a testament to the power of change, both personal and societal, and a reminder that history is as much about the questions we ask as the answers we find. Stay tuned, because the story of Malcolm X is one that defies easy conclusions and demands our continued attention. And so, as Malcolm X stepped into this new chapter like a phoenix rising from the ashes of his past affiliations, he was a man transformed. Gone was the firebrand who once preached separatism with the fervor of a preacher at a tent revival. Instead, Malcolm returned from Mecca with a fresh vision, a new lens through which to view the world, and it wasn't rose-tinted. You see, his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964 was more than a spiritual journey. It was a geopolitical eye-opener. Witnessing Muslims of all races worship together in harmony was like finding out that Santa Claus really exists, and he doesn't care what color your stocking is. This experience shook Malcolm to his core, prompting a shift from his earlier beliefs that would make even the most seasoned politician dizzy. He embraced the idea of unity across racial lines, advocating for equality not just in the black community, but in humanity as a whole. In the American context, this was revolutionary. Picture 1964. The Civil Rights Act was fresh off the legislative press, and racial tensions were tighter than a drum. Malcolm saw the potential for a broader coalition, one that could rally not around shared grievances, but shared humanity. This was no mere ideological tweak. It was a seismic shift that left some of his followers scratching their heads and others ready to march to a new beat, into the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAU, Malcolm's brainchild, birthed in the summer of '64. The OAU was like the political equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, versatile, multifunctional, and ready to tackle the complexities of racial injustice. It aimed to connect the struggles of black Americans with those of oppressed peoples globally. Malcolm was no longer content with just rattling the cage. He wanted to tear it down and build something new. The OAU founding conference was a clarion call for change. Held in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, it brought together activists, intellectuals, and ordinary folks who were fed up with the status quo. Think of it as a Woodstock for the socially conscious, minus the mud and tie-dye. The organization's charter, penned with the precision of a revolutionary manifesto, called for educational reform, voter registration, and economic empowerment. It was a blueprint for a new future, one that sought to dismantle the institutional racism that kept black Americans shackled to the past. Malcolm's influence was growing faster than a cat video going viral today. His speeches drew crowds eager to hear his new message of solidarity and empowerment. While Martin Luther King Jr. was still the darling of the mainstream civil rights movement, Malcolm offered a more radical vision that appealed to those disillusioned by slow progress. His call for human rights, not civil rights, struck a chord with those who recognized that the struggle for equality was not limited to the United States, but was a global affair. Now, let's address the myth that Malcolm X, post-Mecca, became a watered-down version of his former self. Sure, his rhetoric softened in some areas, but the man was still as sharp as a tack. Malcolm didn't trade his firebrand persona for a flower crown. He merely refined his focus. He was still unflinching in his critique of systemic racism and economic exploitation. The economic realities of the time were dire. Black unemployment rates hovered around 7%, nearly twice that of their white counterparts, and redlining kept black families trapped in impoverished neighborhoods. Malcolm didn't just acknowledge these issues. He sought to address them head-on. The OAU economic initiatives aimed to foster black-owned businesses and encourage self-sufficiency. Malcolm envisioned a future where the black community could thrive independently, free from the economic chains of segregation. He was a man on a mission, determined to rewrite the narrative of Black America from one of victimhood to one of empowerment. But let's not ignore the elephant in the room, the political dynamics of the era. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was as paranoid as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. They kept a watchful eye on Malcolm, viewing his growing influence as a threat to national security. COINTELPRO, the FBI's covert operation aimed at surveilling and discrediting civil rights leaders, had Malcolm firmly in its sights. They monitored his every move, treating him like a modern-day Spartacus leading a rebellion against the Roman Empire. Malcolm's ideological shift didn't go unnoticed by his former comrades in the Nation of Islam either. The tension between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad was as thick as a New York cheesecake. The nation, feeling betrayed by Malcolm's departure, viewed him as a renegade who had strayed from the path. The internal strife was like a soap opera without the commercial breaks, full of intrigue, betrayal, and high-stakes drama. As 1964 rolled into 1965, Malcolm's vision for the OAU began to take shape. He traveled extensively, meeting with leaders across Africa and the Middle East, seeking support for his cause. It was like an international scavenger hunt for justice, with Malcolm as the charismatic guide. His efforts to link the African-American struggle with global liberation movements were groundbreaking, positioning him as a key figure in the international human rights arena. But Malcolm's growing influence was a double-edged sword. While he was gaining allies abroad, he was also accumulating enemies at home. The political landscape was fraught with danger, and Malcolm was acutely aware that his life was at risk. He spoke openly about the threats against him, acknowledging the precariousness of his position. It was a sobering reminder that the road to change is often paved with peril. As we reach this juncture in Malcolm's story, the stage is set for the next act. His journey is one of transformation, a testament to the power of personal evolution in the face of adversity. Malcolm X was a man who refused to be defined by his past, who saw the potential for a future unburdened by the limitations of race and division. His legacy is a reminder that change is not a destination, but a journey, one that requires courage, conviction, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Stay tuned, because the story of Malcolm X is like a suspense novel you can't put down. The pages are still turning, and the best is yet to come. Just as Malcolm X's story was reaching its crescendo, stage was set for a dramatic and tragic finale that seemed more suited to a Shakespearean tragedy than the streets of Harlem. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm was preparing to speak before a crowd of eager listeners at the Audubon Ballroom, the same venue where he had once laid out his audacious plans for the organization of Afro-American unity. But this time, the room's anticipation was not for the fiery rhetoric he was known for, but for something far more sinister. Amidst the sea of faces, Malcolm stood vulnerable, a target painted on his back by forces both seen and unseen. The tension was palpable, as if the air itself knew that history was about to take a sharp, harrowing turn. And then chaos erupted. As Malcolm began his address, a disturbance in the crowd drew attention away from the stage. Within moments, shots rang out, a cacophony of violence that would forever silence one of the most provocative voices of the era. Malcolm X was assassinated at the age of 39, his life cut short in a brutal act that seemed both inevitable and unimaginable. The aftermath of Malcolm's assassination was a whirlwind of chaos and conspiracy, a tangled web worthy of a spy thriller. The gunmen, Talmadge Hayer, Norman 3X Butler, and Thomas 15X Johnson, were quickly arrested, each with ties to the Nation of Islam. But the simplicity of this narrative belied the complexity of the forces at play. Many believed that Malcolm's murder was not the result of personal vendettas alone, but rather the culmination of a broader, darker orchestration. The FBI's infamous COINTELPRO program, which had long viewed Malcolm as a destabilizing force, was suspected by some to have played a role, though concrete evidence remains elusive. The trial of Malcolm's accused killers was as much a spectacle as it was a legal proceeding. The courtroom drama unfolded under the gaze of a public hungry for answers, with Hayer confessing to the shooting while maintaining that Butler and Johnson were innocent. Despite his testimony, all three men were convicted, leaving behind a lingering sense of injustice and unanswered questions. It was the kind of resolution that satisfied no one, a murky conclusion to a crime that seemed destined to remain shrouded in mystery. In the wake of Malcolm's death, his legacy took on a life of its own, morphing and evolving in ways that even he might not have anticipated. His autobiography, completed with the help of Alex Haley and published posthumously, became a cornerstone of civil rights literature. It was a candid, unflinching account of his life and philosophy, a window into the mind of a man who had been both revered and reviled. The book's impact was profound, influencing generations of activists and thinkers who found in Malcolm's words a call to arms for justice and equality. But with legacy comes myth, and Malcolm's was no exception. Over the years, he has been cast in various lights, from militant radical to misunderstood martyr. The romantic allure of his story has often overshadowed the gritty reality of his struggle. While Hollywood and popular culture have painted him as a lone revolutionary, the truth is far more nuanced. Malcolm was a man shaped by his times, a product of a society that was as complex as it was unjust. His ideas were not born in a vacuum, but were forged in the crucible of racial and economic oppression. Let's bust a myth or two while we're at it. One of the most persistent misconceptions is that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were diametrically opposed, two polar ends of the civil rights spectrum. While it's true that their approaches differed, King's nonviolent resistance versus Malcolm's more assertive stance, their ultimate goals aligned more closely than many realize. In fact, towards the end of Malcolm's life, there were signs of a thawing between the two. Both men understood that the struggle for civil rights was not a zero-sum game, but rather a multifaceted movement that required diverse tactics and voices. Economically, Malcolm's ideas have left an indelible mark. His call for black economic independence and self-sufficiency resonates today in movements advocating for economic justice and equity. The systemic economic disparities that Malcolm railed against are still very much alive, with wealth gaps and employment inequalities persisting like stubborn stains on the fabric of society. It's a stark reminder that while progress has been made, the work is far from finished. In the modern era, Malcolm X's legacy continues to inspire both admiration and debate. His image, often emblazoned on posters and T-shirts, has become a symbol of defiance and empowerment. Yet, his life story serves as a cautionary tale about the complexities of activism and the personal costs of standing up against entrenched power structures. Malcolm's journey from street hustler to global icon is a testament to the transformative power of conviction, a reminder that change, though fraught with peril, is possible. As we wrap up this exploration of Malcolm X's life and legacy, it's clear that his story is not merely a relic of the past, but a living narrative that continues to shape the present. His voice, once silenced, echoes through the corridors of history, urging us to examine the world with a critical eye and a courageous heart. Malcolm X was a man who defied easy categorization, a complex figure whose impact transcended the boundaries of his time. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson from Malcolm's life is the power of reinvention, the ability to rise, again and again, from the ashes of adversity, driven by an unyielding pursuit of justice. In the bustling valley that would eventually become Mexico City, the Aztecs didn't just appear out of nowhere like a surprise guest at a dinner party. Nope, these folks had a backstory, full of drama, trekking, and enough plot twists to rival any reality show. The tale begins with a scrappy band of Nahuatl-speaking nomads who, somewhere around the 13th century, decided that the swampy landscape of Lake Texcoco was just the place to start their empire-building adventures. Talk about seeing potential in real estate, where others only saw mosquito-infested marshland. The Aztecs, or Mexica as they called themselves, were not exactly welcomed with open arms by their new neighbors. They were more like the small-town newcomers who had to crash the big city's established social scene. According to their own records, this migration was divinely inspired. The god Huitzilopochtli allegedly guided them on their journey, promising them a new home marked by an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its beak. But let's be real, this was less about divine real estate tips and more about survival and seizing opportunities. Now, here's where we debunk the fluffy myth of a peaceful migration. The Aztecs didn't just waltz into the Valley of Mexico and get handed the keys to the kingdom. They fought, forged alliances, and schemed their way into power. Forget the romanticized version of noble savages living in harmony with nature. These were savvy political operators who knew how to play the game. By the early 15th century, they had cozied up to the powerful city-state of Culhuacan, only to eventually turn on their allies and carve out their own piece of the pie. Enter Itzcoatl, the fourth king of Tenochtitlan, and the dude who decided that the Aztecs were destined for greatness. Itzcoatl, whose name literally means obsidian serpent, was the mastermind behind the Aztecs' meteoric rise. He took the throne in 1427 and immediately started reshaping the political landscape like a whirlwind of ambition and strategic ruthlessness. One of his first moves, teaming up with the cities of Texcoco and Tlacopan to form the Triple Alliance. This was the ancient version of a power trio, and together they dismantled the once dominant Tepanec Empire. If you've ever wondered what it takes to build an empire, Itzcoatl would tell you. A bit of cunning, a lot of warfare, and some really solid partnerships. With the Tepanecs out of the way, the Aztecs expanded their influence across the Valley of Mexico, demanding tribute and loyalty from conquered peoples. And let's not sugarcoat what tribute meant. This was not a friendly gift exchange. We're talking about systematic demands for goods, labor, and at times, human sacrifices to appease their sun god and keep the cosmos from imploding. This was a society where religion and politics were inextricably linked, and the gods were always hungry. Itzcoatl also understood the power of narrative. The dude ordered the burning of old Aztec historical codices and rewrote history to favor the Mexicas' divine destiny. Talk about controlling the narrative. It was a PR move that would make any spin doctor proud. By erasing inconvenient truths and highlighting the Mexicas' divine right to rule, Itzcoatl ensured that future generations saw the Aztecs not just as conquerors, but as the chosen people of the gods. So, while it's tempting to think of the Aztec Empire as a peaceful civilization of pyramid builders and feathered headdresses, their origin story is far grittier, filled with conflict, cunning, and a relentless drive for power. Itzcoatl laid the groundwork for an empire that would dominate Mesoamerica until the Spanish came knocking. And if this is just the beginning of their story, you can bet that things are about to get even more intense. Stay tuned, because the Aztecs were just getting started, and their tale is anything but predictable. As the Aztec story unfolded, Tenochtitlan emerged as their crown jewel, a metropolis that would have given any modern city a run for its money. Imagine a sprawling urban center rising from the swamps of Lake Texcoco, with enough architectural flair to make even the most jaded traveler do a double-take. This wasn't just any city. Tenochtitlan was the beating heart of the Aztec Empire, a Mesoamerican Manhattan, if you will, complete with floating gardens and bustling marketplaces that put the hustle in hustle and bustle. Let's dive into these floating gardens, or chinampas, which weren't just Instagrammable landscapes, but a testament to Aztec ingenuity. Picture narrow strips of fertile land constructed atop the lake using mud and vegetation, a kind of ancient hydroponics. These chinampas could produce up to 7 harvests a year, which is basically the agricultural equivalent of hitting the jackpot. It was efficiency on steroids, ensuring that Tenochtitlan's population, which hit around 200,000 at its peak, was well-fed and thriving. That's more people than lived in London at the same time, just to give you a sense of scale. But it wasn't all about food. The economy of Tenochtitlan was a well-oiled machine, powered by bustling marketplaces that were the envy of the ancient world. The main market at Tlacopan was a sharper's paradise, with tens of thousands of vendors selling everything from obsidian blades sharper than your uncle's tongue to exotic feathers that would put a peacock to shame. This was the Wall Street of the Aztec world, but with fewer suits and more cacao beans. Ah, cacao. If there's one thing the Aztecs knew how to do, it was to elevate chocolate to legendary status. Forget golden tickets. Cacao beans were the real currency of the time. We're talking about a world where you could buy a tamale for a single cacao bean or a turkey hen for 100. Cacao was so valuable that it was often used to pay taxes, which makes you wonder if the IRS would accept Hershey bars today. But let's be real. This wasn't about indulging in guilty pleasures. Chocolate was considered a gift from the gods, and consuming it was like sipping on a divine elixir. Montezuma Roman II, the ninth king, reportedly drank 50 cups of chocolate a day, which is either impressive or just plain excessive, depending on your caffeine tolerance. This bustling economy was lubricated by a complex tribute system where subject states paid up in goods like textiles, exotic animals, and you guessed it, more cacao. This wasn't some friendly barter system. It was more like a coerced Amazon Prime delivery service, where failing to deliver could have dire consequences. But hey, when you're keeping the cosmos from imploding, a little strong-arming seems justified, right? Beyond the economic engine was the architectural marvel of Tenochtitlan itself. The city was laid out in a grid pattern with causeways connecting it to the mainland, and canals crisscrossing the city like Venice on steroids. In the center stood the Templo Mayor, a massive double pyramid dedicated to the gods Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, because why settle for one deity when you can have two? The temple was a stage for elaborate ceremonies, including human sacrifices, a harsh reality that's a bit of a buzzkill if you're picturing a peaceful society of pyramid builders. But let's not sugarcoat it. These sacrifices were seen as necessary to appease the gods and ensure the sun rose each day. Talk about a high-stakes performance review. While Tenochtitlan dazzled with its architectural prowess and economic might, it was also a political powerhouse. The Aztecs were masters of statecraft, balancing alliances and rivalries like seasoned diplomats. The city was the nerve center of the Triple Alliance, and its rulers were adept at playing neighboring city-states against each other, ensuring that Tenochtitlan remained at the top of the heap. This was Machiavelli before Machiavelli, with a side of human sacrifice to keep things interesting. And speaking of keeping things interesting, let's not forget the Aztecs' flair for the dramatic. Their storytelling wasn't just about preserving history. It was about crafting a narrative that solidified their divine right to rule. Whether through monumental architecture or mythic tales, the Aztecs knew that perception was everything. They were the original spin doctors, ensuring that their legacy would be as enduring as the stones of Tenochtitlan itself. As we leave the bustling streets of Tenochtitlan behind, it's clear that the city's story is far from over. The Aztecs had built an empire that was as sophisticated as it was brutal, a civilization driven by ambition and shrouded in myth. But remember, this is just the midpoint in their saga. The Spanish haven't arrived yet, and the Aztecs are about to face challenges that will test their mettle and define their place in history. So stick around, because the plot is about to thicken in ways even the Aztecs couldn't have foreseen. But before the Spanish could even think about gate-crashing the Aztec Empire's party, we need to dive into the political scene of Tenochtitlan, where the Aztec emperors weren't just sitting on golden thrones with feathered crowns. They were more like marathon runners on a treadmill of political intrigue. Let's start with the title, Tlatoni, which means speaker, a bit of an understatement for someone juggling divine expectations and earthly politics, don't you think? Here's the thing. The Aztec emperor was supposed to be a god-like figure, a man who had a direct line to the divine. But in reality, he was more like the ultimate political player navigating an ever-shifting chessboard. Forget the idea of a divine puppet. This was a leader who had to keep the nobility in check, fend off potential usurpers, and ensure the empire's expansion while making sure the guards were appeased. In other words, the emperor's role was a high-wire act with no safety net. Take Moctezuma Roman II, for instance. On the surface, he was every bit the divine ruler, a man whose mere presence was enough to inspire awe. But beneath the opulent exterior, Moctezuma was a shrewd politician who knew that maintaining power required more than just divine favor. It demanded strategic alliances, and at times, ruthless decisions. And let's not gloss over the fact that his tenure was punctuated by challenges both external and internal, making it clear that being the emperor was more blood sport than divine right. The political system was a complex web, with the emperor at its center, surrounded by a council of nobles who could make or break him. Think of it as an ancient version of a board of directors, only with more obsidian knives and fewer PowerPoint presentations. These nobles held significant sway, and their support was crucial. The emperor had to be a master diplomat, balancing the interests of various factions, each with its own agenda. It was a constant game of appeasement, where a single misstep could lead to rebellion. And if you thought the emperor's job was tough, spare a thought for the Calpics, the empire's tax collectors. These guys were the unsung heroes, or perhaps the villains, depending on your perspective, tasked with ensuring that the empire's coffers remained full. They traveled throughout the empire, collecting tributes in the form of goods, labor, and yes, sometimes people. It was a risky business, and Calpics often had to handle disgruntled subject states with the diplomatic grace of a tightrope walker in a hurricane. Speaking of tribute, let's explore how this system wasn't just about hoarding resources. It was about consolidating power. The tribute economy was the empire's lifeblood, a carefully orchestrated symphony where every note had to hit just right. Subject states were kept in check, not just by military might, but through economic dependence. By controlling the flow of goods and resources, the Aztecs ensured their dominance. It was a strategy that was as brilliant as it was brutal, keeping the wheels of the empire turning while reminding everyone who was boss. Now, let's debunk the myth of a rigid, top-down hierarchy where everyone knew their place and stuck to it. The Aztec social structure was more fluid than you might think. Sure, there were classes, nobles, commoners, and slaves, but social mobility wasn't entirely out of the question. A talented warrior could rise through the ranks, earning land and titles. Even craftsmen had a kind of union known as a calpulli, which was both a social and economic unit, providing support and protection to its members. In fact, craftsmen were highly valued in Aztec society, skilled artisans who produced everything from intricate jewelry to the tools of war. Their work was essential to the economy, and they enjoyed a level of respect that many medieval European craftsmen could only dream of. Imagine guilds that had the backing of not just the local lord, but the emperor himself. It was a system that recognized the importance of skilled labor, long before the industrial titans of later centuries would make it fashionable. Religion and politics were intertwined in a way that would make any modern political strategist take notes. The emperor was not just a political leader, but also a religious figure, expected to perform rituals and sacrifices to ensure cosmic stability. It was a role that required not just charisma, but a deep understanding of the spiritual beliefs that underpinned the empire. In a society where failing to appease the gods could spell disaster, the stakes were always high. And while we're myth-busting, let's tackle the idea of a homogeneous society united under a single cultural banner. The Aztec Empire was a mosaic of different cultures and languages, a patchwork quilt of conquered peoples who brought their own traditions and beliefs into the fold. This diversity was both a strength and a challenge, requiring a delicate balance of assimilation and autonomy. The Aztecs were adept at integrating these diverse groups, often allowing them to maintain certain cultural practices while ensuring loyalty to the empire. This was a world where politics, economics, and religion were inextricably linked, each one influencing the other in a complex dance that kept the empire running. It was a society that understood the power of narrative, using myths and legends not just to entertain, but to legitimize their rule. The Aztecs were masters at crafting a story that ensured their place in history, a narrative that continues to captivate us even today. As we peel back the layers of the Aztec political system, it becomes clear that this was a society driven by both the divine and the pragmatic. The emperor was a figure who straddled both worlds, a politician forced to navigate a minefield of alliances and rebellions while ensuring the gods were kept happy. It was a role that required not just strength, but a keen understanding of the human condition, balancing act that defined the Aztec Empire at the height of its power. But hold on to your ceremonial headdresses, because the story isn't over yet. As the Aztecs continue to navigate the complexities of empire building, external forces are gathering on the horizon, ready to test the mettle of a civilization that has so far defied the odds. The Spanish are looming, and the stage is set for a clash that will alter the course of history. But before we get there, there's more to uncover, more layers to peel back, and more truths to reveal about a world where politics was a blood sport, and the stakes were nothing short of cosmic. Just as we were about to take a cosmic leap into the clash of cultures, let's halt for a hot second and unravel the divine drama that made the Aztecs tick. This was a world where gods weren't just celestial cheerleaders watching from the sidelines. They were the main event, demanding front row seats in the theater of life, and sometimes a little more than just applause. Forget your Sunday best when visiting the Aztec pantheon. They expected blood, sweat, and literal tears. Now, when it comes to religious practices, the Aztecs were like the ultimate spiritual overachievers. They had a pantheon so crowded it could fill a cosmic stadium, with guards for rain, war, agriculture, and even drunkenness. Yes, you heard that right. Tezcatlipoca, the god of chaos and war, could also make time for a party. Their calendar was a divine to-do list, with rituals and ceremonies meticulously planned, ensuring that the cosmos kept spinning and those pesky natural disasters were kept at bay. Let's address the elephant, or should I say, the jaguar, in the room: human sacrifice. While Hollywood loves to paint the Aztecs as bloodthirsty savages, the reality is a complex tapestry of belief and necessity. The Aztecs believed that the sun god, Huitzilopochtli, needed a daily dose of human hearts to keep the sun on its path. You might say he had a rather specific dietary requirement. This wasn't mindless brutality. It was a cosmic quid pro quo. In their worldview, every sunrise was bought with the currency of life, a stark reminder that nothing in the universe is free. So, how big was this sacrificial operation, you ask? The dedication of the Templo Mayor alone saw the sacrifice of thousands over 4 days, a gruesome festival that was as much about political power as it was about piety. The Aztecs knew that a good show of devotion could keep both guards and subjects in check. And while it's easy to judge from the comfort of the 21st century, remember, in a world teetering on the edge of chaos, these rituals were seen as life insurance against cosmic catastrophe. Of course, the Aztecs didn't just wing it when it came to sacrifices. This was a society that excelled in organization, from their bustling marketplaces to their celestial observatories. Enter the Aztec calendar, a mind-boggling system that made the Mayans look like they were still using sundials. The Aztecs employed 2 calendars: the tonal Pohualli, a 260-day cycle used for divination, and the Zu Pohualli, a 365-day agricultural calendar. Together, these calendars formed a 52-year century, the time frame in which they believed the world could end or be renewed. This meticulous timekeeping wasn't just for show. It guided every aspect of Aztec life, from agricultural cycles to religious ceremonies. The calendar was their cosmic playbook, ensuring that every sacrifice, every festival, every prayer was perfectly timed to keep the universe in balance. In a way, calendar was a testament to the Aztecs' understanding of their environment, a sophisticated tool that reflected their need to impose order on a chaotic world. But let's not forget the Aztecs' flair for storytelling. Their myths weren't just bedtime stories. They were historical narratives crafted to reinforce their divine mandate. The legend of the 5 Suns, for instance, was a cosmic soap opera portraying a universe that had been created and destroyed 4 times before, with the Aztecs living under the 5th sun, tasked with keeping it alive. This myth wasn't just a tale. It was a blueprint for existence, a reminder that their duty to the gods was all that stood between them and oblivion. Now, if this all sounds a bit grim, it's worth noting that Aztec religion was as much about celebration as it was about sacrifice. Their festivals were vibrant affairs, full of music, dance, and feasting. The festival of Tlaquetzalpualistli, dedicated to the flayed god Xipe-Totec, involved mock battles and ritual skinning, followed by a feast. Talk about taking dinner and a show to a whole new level. While we're myth-busting, let's tackle the notion of a monolithic Aztec religion. The truth is, the Aztec Empire was a mosaic of different beliefs and practices, a reflection of the diverse cultures they absorbed. Each city-state brought its own gods to the party, and the Aztecs were more than willing to add them to the lineup, provided they paid homage to Huitzilopochtli. This was less about religious purity and more about political pragmatism, ensuring loyalty through shared worship. In this world of divine drama and celestial bookkeeping, the Aztecs found meaning and order. Their religion was a kaleidoscope of fear, hope, and cosmic responsibility, a worldview that demanded as much from them as it promised. It was a belief system that wove the spiritual into the everyday, reminding the Aztecs of their place in the universe and their duty to keep it spinning. As we leave the Aztec gods to their celestial theatrics, it's clear that religion was more than just a backdrop. It was the stage on which the entire empire performed. The Aztecs had crafted a world where the lines between myth and reality blurred, where every sunrise was a testament to their devotion, and every sacrifice a reminder of their cosmic role. But as we've seen, this was not a tale of mindless superstition, but a complex dance of power, politics, and faith. And so, as we prepare to step back into the mortal realm of politics and power struggles, remember that the Aztecs weren't just playing a game of thrones. They were engaged in a cosmic chess match where every move had the weight of the universe behind it. With the Spanish looming on the horizon, this intricate dance of faith and power is about to face its ultimate test. But that's a story for another day, where the stakes will be higher, the players more desperate, and the outcome as unpredictable as the rise of the sun. The stage is set, the players are in position, and the Aztec Empire's grand finale is about to unfold. This tale isn't just about the Spanish conquistadors marching in with their fancy steel and shiny helmets. It's a story of how a myriad of factors, disease, alliances gone sour, and political blunders, converged in a perfect storm, unraveling an empire that had, until then, defied the odds. So, let's dive into what really went down when the Aztecs met their match. First, let's talk about the uninvited guest that crashed the Aztec party: disease. Smallpox, the not-so-friendly neighborhood virus, arrived with the Spanish and spread faster than gossip at a royal court. By 1520, it had decimated the Aztec population, which had once been as high as 5 million. This wasn't just a health crisis. It was a social and economic apocalypse. Fields went untended, markets fell silent, and the once bustling streets of Tenochtitlan were eerily quiet. The Aztecs hadn't developed immunity to old-world diseases, so the impact was catastrophic. In a cruel twist of fate, this invisible enemy did more damage than all the Spanish swords combined. Speaking of swords, Hernán Cortés and his merry band of conquistadors played their part, but not in the way you might expect. While it's tempting to picture them as the lone culprits, the reality was far more complicated. Cortés was a master manipulator, a man who could have given Machiavelli a run for his money. Upon arriving in 1519, he quickly realized that brute force wouldn't be enough. Instead, he tapped into existing tensions between the Aztecs and their subject states. Here's where betrayal enters the chat. Cortés forged alliances with disgruntled city-states like Tlaxcala, who were eager to knock the Aztecs down a peg or two. With promises of independence and revenge, he turned these rivalries into a coalition against the Mexica. This wasn't a simple outsider invasion. It was a civil war by proxy, with Cortés as the puppet master pulling the strings. And then there's Moctezuma Roman II, who found himself in a political quagmire that would have stumped the savviest of leaders. Upon meeting Cortés, Moctezuma was caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Do you greet the newcomers as potential allies or threats? Spoiler alert. He opted for diplomacy, showering Cortés with gifts and hoping to gain favor. But this only emboldened the Spaniards, who saw it as a sign of weakness rather than strategy. Political missteps didn't stop there. As tensions rose, Moctezuma became a prisoner in his own palace, held hostage by Cortés. The emperor's indecision and attempts at appeasement failed to rally his people, sowing confusion and division. The Aztecs, who once revered their Tlatoni as a divine figure, were left leaderless at a critical juncture. When Moctezuma was killed, whether by a Spanish blow or an Aztec stone remains debated, it was a devastating blow to Aztec morale. But the final act was yet to come. In 1521, after a brutal siege that lasted months, the Spanish and their indigenous allies finally breached the defenses of Tenochtitlan. The city, once a jewel of Mesoamerica, was left in ruins, its population decimated by war, starvation, and disease. It was a tragic end to a civilization that had achieved so much in such a short time. And yet, the legacy of the Aztecs endures. Their influence on modern Mexico is undeniable, from the iconic eagle and serpent on the national flag to the continued celebration of traditions like the Day of the Dead, which has roots in Aztec rituals. Even the name Mexico itself is derived from Mexica, the Aztecs' own name for their people. But the Aztecs have also carved out a niche in global pop culture. From movies to video games, they've become symbols of mystery and might, often portrayed with a mix of awe and horror. While these depictions can sometimes veer into the realm of myth, they also keep the flame of curiosity alive, prompting new generations to explore the truths behind the legends. So, As we reflect on the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire, let's remember it as more than just a tragic tale of conquest. It was a complex society, one that demonstrated both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human frailty. The Aztecs were architects of their destiny, navigating a world of gods and men with a flair that still captivates us today. In the end, the story of the Aztecs is a reminder that history is rarely black and white. It's a tapestry woven with threads of power, ambition, and vulnerability, a testament to the enduring dance between civilization and chaos. As we close the book on this chapter, let's take away not just the facts and figures, but the understanding that history's greatest narratives are those that reveal the richness of the human experience. And with that, our journey through the Aztec world comes to an end, leaving us with both lessons learned and mysteries yet to be unraveled. You wake up squished between unwashed bodies in a stone room that smells like a medieval lacquer room. Yes, this is your life now, and no, there's no escape. Welcome to the charming experience of a medieval siege, where personal space is as mythical as dragons, and the only thing overflowing is the chamber part. You're packed within the castle walls, because out there, an army is having a long-term slumber party with plans to starve you out. Let's talk about why you're in this smelly situation to begin with. Siege warfare was the medieval version of the ultimate staring contest. Who could last longer, the besieged or the besieger? It wasn't just about brute force, but patience and logistics. The goal: starve the enemy into submission. The romantic tales you've heard about gallant knights charging into battle, mostly tales. Real sieges were slow, strategic, and downright grimy affairs. Castles, those stone behemoths that dart the European landscape, weren't just built for their Instagrammable aesthetics. They were fortresses, the medieval answer to keep out signs. Take the Siege of Orleans in 1428-1429, for example. The English wanted to choke off France's resources by capturing Orleans. But Joan of Arc, a teenager with more grit than most of us muster on a Monday morning, turned the tide. She wasn't wielding magic, just sheer determination and some divine pep talks. Her story shows that sometimes the castle's walls were less about stone and more about the spirit inside them. Speaking of walls, building these fortresses wasn't cheap. A castle could cost the medieval equivalent of millions today. Warwick Castle, for instance, had a construction cost of around £19,000 in the 14th century. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking serious money, enough to make modern real estate look like pocket change. Maintaining them, another financial headache. A castle was like a medieval money pit, constantly needing repairs and upgrades to keep up with the neighbors' latest crenellations. Now, let's consider the human side of this equation. You're not alone in this castle. Oh no, that would be too easy. Look around, and you'll see hundreds, perhaps thousands, of fellow castlemates. During the siege of Kenilworth in 1266, around 200 soldiers and civilians were crammed into the castle, and everyone, from the lord to the lowliest serf, had to eat. But with supply lines cut, you're relying on whatever was stockpiled before the siege began. Hope you like dried peas and salted meat, because that's the gourmet menu until further notice. Feeding an army was one of the logistical nightmares of medieval warfare. A medieval soldier on campaign could consume up to 3,000 calories a day. Multiply that by the hundreds or thousands of troops, and you've got a food bill that could make a king weep. But inside the castle, rationing becomes a grim art. You might find yourself dreaming of the days when ale flowed and bread was fresh. Now, you're measuring meals in desperation and hoping the siege ends before the pantry does. Despite these grim realities, the allure of the castle siege remains. There's something undeniably dramatic about the idea of holding out against all odds, even if it means trading comfort for survival. So, as you sit there contemplating your third serving of pottage, remember that while the romantic stories have their place, the real story is one of endurance and sometimes sheer stubbornness. Keep that in mind as the day drags on, and you try to find a spot in the castle that smells slightly less like a stable. As you're sitting there, trying to convince yourself that stale bread is a delicacy, let's pivot to the midday entertainment, psychological warfare. Forget Game of Thrones. This was the real mind game. Both sides, besieged and besieger, played a mental chess match designed to break each other's will. The besiegers might shout taunts over the walls or hurl insults, and occasionally rotting animal carcasses to spread disease and demoralize the defenders. And yes, those trebuchets weren't just for show. They were the heavy artillery of the Middle Ages, capable of flinging 90-kilogram stones over 300 meters. That's about the weight of an average sumo wrestler hurtling through the sky at your stone fortress. Talk about a high-stakes game of catch. On the defensive side, psychological tactics were just as crucial. You might see a defender putting up a bold front by parading a lavish feast on the ramparts, knowing full well it was their last chicken, and a few turnips masquerading as abundance. It was a classic case of fake it till you make it, or in this case, fake it till you starve. The goal was to make the besiegers think you could hold out forever, even if you were down to your last crumb by sunset. And let's not forget the role of siege engines like battering rams, those hulking beasts of war that were about as subtle as a sledgehammer at a tea party. These wooden monstrosities, often topped with a metal cap, were designed to break down the castle doors or walls. Picture a massive log, sometimes covered with wet hides to prevent it from being set alight, repeatedly smashing into the gate. Not exactly a gentle knock. Now, about those chivalric knights. The romantic image of a shining knight galloping to the rescue is, alas, largely a product of later storytelling. In reality, knights were often more concerned with ransom and loot than honor and glory. The battlefield was no place for poetry. It was brutal, chaotic, and dirty. Picture this. The average knight's armor weighed around 20 to 25 kilograms. Sure, it offered protection, but try swinging a sword effectively while wearing what feels like a metallic sauna suit. And those famed jousts, they were more like medieval demolition derbies than heroic duels. While the knights were busy clanking around, the common soldiers and serfs were dealing with arguably the most insidious enemy of all, disease. Sieges were breeding grounds for illness, thanks to the cramped quarters and less than ideal sanitation. The Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, thrived in such conditions. Imagine sharing your living space with rats, carriers of fleas, the tiny culprits behind the plague. Hygiene was, let's say, optional. There was no Purell on hand, and baths were infrequent at best. You'd be lucky to wash once a month, and even then it was considered a luxury. As if the threat of plague wasn't enough, there was also dysentery, a charming gastrointestinal nightmare that was common in siege conditions due to contaminated water and poor sanitation. You've got entire armies and civilian populations crammed inside a castle with limited facilities. It's safe to say that the medieval porta-potty situation left a lot to be desired. So here you are, trying to balance between the romanticized tales of gallant knights and the gritty, grim reality of medieval siege warfare. It's a world where the line between heroism and survival blurs, where psychological manipulation is as potent as any sword, and where disease is as deadly as any enemy army. As you ponder this, the day drags on, and you find yourself once again contemplating the less than glamorous realities of life under siege. But fear not, because the story isn't over yet. As the sun sets, casting its last light over the besieged fortress, there's more to uncover about this fascinating chapter of history. As the sun dips lower, casting long shadows over the besieged fortress, let's shift gears to what really fueled these medieval standoffs. Cold, hard cash. Or, well, the medieval version of it. Sieges weren't just about who could hold their breath the longest. They were economic calculations wrapped in tactical maneuvers. Think of them as the hostile takeovers of the medieval era, where the boardroom was the battlefield, and the currency was blood, sweat, and very literal tears. Let's talk numbers. The cost of waging a siege was astronomical, and no one knew this better than the kings and lords who footed the bill. Take Edward I of England, who in the late 13th century spent around £30,000 on the siege of Caerlaverock. Adjusted for today, that's roughly the GDP of a small island nation. Why spend that much? Easy, control and power. Capturing a castle wasn't just a tactical win, it was a political checkmate. Hold the castle, and you control the region's resources, roads, and, most importantly, its people. And speaking of people, let's not forget the lovely practice of ransoming. Knights and nobles often found themselves on the medieval version of eBay, priced according to their rank and wealth. The higher your status, the more you were worth, which sounds flattering, until you realize it's based on your captor's estimation of your pal's wallets. Richard the Lionheart famously became the most expensive prison guest ever when he was captured in 1192. His ransom, a cool 150,000 marks, about 3 times England's annual income. Now, that's what you call a royal headache. But it wasn't just the big wigs feeling the pinch. Local populations bore the brunt of these prolonged sieges. Townsfolk trapped in this medieval Game of Thrones were often caught between the rock of their collapsing economy and the hard place of an enemy camped at their gates. Crops were trampled, trade routes blocked, and livelihoods shattered. In the siege of Rouen from 1418 to 1419, the local population suffered so much that famine became a more immediate threat than the enemy. Chroniclers like Jean de Wavrin recorded the desperation, noting how the besieged resorted to eating cats, dogs, and whatever else wasn't nailed down. Bon appetit. Desperation breeds resourcefulness, and nowhere is this more evident than in the countless tales of espionage and sabotage that pepper siege history. Forget the sanitized, polished spy dramas of today. Medieval espionage was gritty and downright hazardous. Take the siege of Constantinople in 1453. The city defenders, aware their days were numbered, used every trick in the book, from secretly smuggling in supplies to employing mercenaries to sabotage Ottoman plans. The Byzantines even resorted to psychological warfare, spreading rumors of incoming reinforcements to dishearten the besiegers. It was less James Bond and more medieval MacGyver, but effective nonetheless. Now, let's add some spice to this cauldron of chaos with the role of sabotage. Remember those siege engines we talked about? They didn't all get the chance to shine. Many were sabotaged before they could unleash their destructive potential. Saboteurs, often local sympathizers or even disgruntled soldiers, would sneak into enemy camps under the cover of darkness to set fire to trebuchets or poison water supplies. It was a high-risk, high-reward game. Getting caught meant a swift and unpleasant end. Medieval warfare was less about romantic duels and more about cunning, creativity, and a healthy dose of audacity. The political chess game of sieges also saw some intriguing players. Take the siege of Acre during the Third Crusade. A microcosm of medieval geopolitics, it saw the likes of Richard the Lionheart and Philip Roman II of France teaming up, albeit uneasily, to wrest control from the Muslims. Despite their mutual disdain, they knew that the key to success lay in cooperation. The siege dragged on for 2 years, with the Christian forces eventually prevailing, but not without cost. The prolonged military engagement drained resources and morale, proving that even the mightiest of leaders needed more than just bravado to succeed. Yet for all its brutality and hardship, the allure of the siege remains. Perhaps it's the stark drama of survival against the odds, or the gritty tales of human resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity. But while the legends weave a tapestry of heroism and valor, the reality was often far less glamorous. It was a world where a single misstep could tip the scales, where economic interests and political ambitions collided with the very human need for survival. As the afternoon heat gives way to the cooler dusk, you're left contemplating the staggering costs and the human stories buried beneath the rubble of history. You might find yourself pondering the resilience of those who endured these sieges, their tales of desperation and ingenuity echoing through time. But the story doesn't end here. As night falls, the siege continues, and so does the saga of this fascinating chapter of history. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover in the medieval world of siege warfare. As the cool night air settles over the besieged fortress, you might think the day's chaos would give way to a quiet, contemplative evening. But don't get too comfortable. This isn't a medieval spa retreat. Instead, it's time to reflect on the cultural tapestry woven from these relentless sieges, where legends were born, betrayals plotted, and the fine line between heroism and folly blurred like a watercolor left out in the rain. Let's start with the legends, those tantalizing tales that make you think a siege was all about honor and valor. Take the story of El Cid, Spain's knightly icon, who became a symbol of Christian resistance against Muslim rule. He was the medieval action hero, full of charisma and apparently superhuman courage. El Cid's exploits during the siege of Valencia in 1094 were the stuff of epic poetry, literally. The Cantor de Mio Cid, immortalized him with as much accuracy as a Hollywood biopic. Sure, he was brave, but his story was as much about political maneuvering as battlefield prowess. Think of him as the medieval equivalent of a rock star with a really sharp sword. Now, let's add a splash of betrayal to this medieval mix. The siege of Limoges in 1370 serves as a stark reminder that not all tales have a noble hero. The city, loyal to both the French crown and the English due to complex vassalage ties, found itself in a pickle. When Edward the Black Prince, England's golden boy, besieged the city, the defenders were betrayed by their own bishop, who threw open the gates. Edward's subsequent wrath resulted in a brutal massacre, which was less about chivalry and more about teaching a bloody lesson. The reality here is clear. Alliances were as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. But beneath these grand narratives, what about the everyday folks? Those whose names weren't etched into history, but bore the brunt of these sieges. For them, life was a grim cycle of fear, hunger, and disease, punctuated by the occasional catapulted cow. Starvation wasn't just a tactic, it was a daily ordeal. In the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade, the city's inhabitants were so desperate they resorted to eating leather shoes. Let that sink in next time you complain about soggy cereal. The end of a siege often brought little respite. When the dust settled and the victors claimed their prize, the consequences rippled far beyond the castle walls. Consider the siege of Antioch in 1098, where the Crusaders, after finally breaching the city, found themselves besieged in turn by Turkish forces. The victors became the besieged, a brutal reminder that in medieval warfare, triumph and disaster often shared a bed. The city's fall didn't just shift power, it altered the course of the Crusades and reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the region. Yet, not all sieges ended in bloodshed. Some concluded with a flick of the quill rather than the sword. Negotiations were often the quiet heroes of siege warfare. Take the siege of Acre in 1291, where the besieged Europeans, realizing the futility of further resistance against the Mamluks, sought terms. The outcome was grim, but it highlights a crucial point. Sometimes, survival trumped glory. Of course, the long-term effects of these sieges on medieval society were profound. Economically, they drained resources faster than you can say, feudal levy. The continuous cycle of destruction and rebuilding left regions in perpetual recovery mode. Socially, the scars ran deep. The siege of Lisbon in 1147, during the Second Crusade, brought thousands of foreign soldiers to the city. The resulting cultural exchange was as awkward as a medieval family reunion, with language barriers and differing customs causing friction and fusion in equal measure. And while we're myth-busting, let's tackle the idea of the noble resistance. Sure, there were moments of gallant defiance, but for every brave stand, there was an equal measure of desperation and pragmatism. During the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, King John's forces used pig fat to burn down the keep's wooden supports, forcing the rebels to surrender. It wasn't a noble standoff, but rather a grim reminder that ingenuity often trumped valor. As you mull over these tales of valor and villainy, remember that the real story wasn't just about who won or lost. It was about survival in a world where the stakes were as high as the castle walls. The next time you hear stories of grand sieges, remember there's always more beneath the surface, more grit, more survival, and a lot more human complexity than the legends suggest. As the moon rises, bathing the fortress in a silvery glow, you're left contemplating this rich tapestry of human endurance. The siege isn't over, and there's still more to uncover in this fascinating saga of medieval resilience. But as the night deepens, so does our understanding of the intricate dance between legend and reality, and the enduring human spirit that perseveres against all odds. Stay tuned, because the story is far from finished. As the moon illuminates those formidable stone walls, casting an ethereal glow over your grim surroundings, let's dive into why you, my dear listener, would probably call it quits faster than you can say siege warfare. The truth is, living through a medieval siege wasn't for the faint-hearted or the weak-stomached. It was a test of endurance, both physical and mental, that few modern souls would pass. First up, physical challenges. If you're thinking that medieval sieges were all about gallant last stands and heroic gestures, think again. The reality was closer to a survival reality show with a medieval twist. Imagine being crammed into a smelly, overcrowded fortress with hundreds of others, all vying for the same dwindling supplies. Showers. Forget it. You're lucky if you get a bucket of water, and even then, it's about as clean as your average medieval chamber part. The siege of Kenilworth in 1266 saw over 200 people confined within the castle walls, sharing not just space, but also the delightful aroma of unwashed bodies and festering wounds. Then there's the food, or lack thereof. During the siege of Orleans in 1428-1429, the French defenders were so desperate they had to ration their already scant provisions to last the grueling 8-month ordeal. You think you get hangry after missing lunch? Try enduring a siege where your daily diet might consist of a handful of dried peas and a sliver of salted meat, if you're lucky. And here's a fun fact. The average medieval soldier burned around 3,000 calories a day, mostly from standing watch or scurrying to avoid incoming projectiles. Good luck meeting that on pottage and dreams. But let's not forget the psychological warfare. It wasn't just about lobbing insults and rotten cows over the castle walls. Both sides played a relentless game of mental chess, each maneuver designed to break the other's spirit. The besiegers might stage mock celebrations or display lavish feasts to demoralize their starving opponents. Meanwhile, the defenders were busy pretending that their last chicken dinner was merely the appetizer to a banquet. It was a theater of the absurd, where both sides were actors in a grim play of deception and desperation. And if that wasn't enough, how about the constant threat of disease? Thanks to the delightful combination of cramped quarters and poor sanitation, a medieval fortress under siege was a petri dish of potential plagues. The Black Death, which wiped out roughly 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, thrived in such conditions. Rats, fleas, and questionable hygiene were your constant companions, making the prospect of a quick death by sword almost appealing in comparison. Now, let's talk about the logistical nightmare of maintaining a siege. For the attackers, keeping an army fed and motivated was no small feat. Edward I's siege of Caerlaverock in 1300 cost him a whopping £30,000, enough to make any modern CFO break out in a cold sweat. And yet, the payoff could justify the expense. Control of a strategic location, access to resources, and a hefty ransom if you captured the right noble. It was the ultimate high-risk, high-reward venture. But what about the defenders? They weren't just sitting ducks waiting to be plucked. Medieval sieges were as much about cunning and subterfuge as they were about brute force. The defenders of Constantinople in 1453 used covert operations and sabotage to disrupt the Ottoman plans. It was anything-goes warfare, where espionage and strategic marriages were just as important as swords and armor. Speaking of armor, let's debunk the myth of the chivalric knight in shining armor. The reality: knights were more interested in loot and ransoms than in rescuing damsels. Their armor, while impressive, was a cumbersome 20 to 25 kilograms, perfect for turning a sprint into a slow-motion shuffle. And those jousts, think more demolition derby than elegant duel. In the grand tapestry of history, these sieges have left an indelible mark, not just on the medieval world, but on ours too. They've inspired countless tales of heroism and horror, from epic poems like The Song of Roland to modern video games and films. Think of the adrenaline-pumping moments in Game of Thrones or the strategic depth of Age of Empires. These stories tap into our fascination with survival against the odds, painting a picture that's equal parts romantic and raw. Yet, while we celebrate the legends, it's crucial to remember the harsh realities behind them. The economic toll on besieged cities was devastating, turning bustling trade hubs into ghost towns. The siege of Rouen in 1418-1419 left the city on the brink of collapse, with famine forcing residents to eat anything remotely edible. And politically, the stakes were enormous. A successful siege could shift power dynamics and redraw maps, as seen in the fall of Acre in 1291, which marked the end of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. So, as you drift off to sleep, with these tales of medieval resilience and resourcefulness swirling in your mind, appreciate the layers of history that lie beneath the romantic veneer. These sieges were not just battles. They were complex, multifaceted events that tested the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. They remind us that while legends may dazzle, the reality is often gritty and grim. But therein lies the true story, the story of human resilience, where the will to survive shines brighter than any chivalric tale. As the first glimmers of dawn creep over the horizon, you're jolted awake not by the gentle chime of a smartphone alarm, but by the biting slap of the North Sea breeze and the groaning of timber. Welcome to life aboard a Viking longship. It's not exactly the plush cruise you might have seen in those romanticized TV shows. Instead, you're on a floating wooden beast, about 65 to 80 feet long and 16 feet wide, packed with 30 to 60 of your closest Norse comrades. And by closest, I mean you're practically breathing down each other's necks. Forget about stretching luxuriously as you rise. There's no room for that nonsense here. You're wedged between two burly warriors who are both snoring like thunderclouds. These sleeping quarters are so cramped they make a budget airline seat look like a king's throne. The bed is basically a wooden board under your back, with a cloak tossed over you as a makeshift blanket. Yeah, comfort isn't really a priority when you're hell-bent on plundering or trading your way to glory. Now, let's address the menu of this fine establishment. Dried fish. Fancy a breakfast that's more about practicality than pleasure. Dried fish is your friend or enemy, depending on your perspective. Packed with protein and easy to store, it's the Viking version of fast food. It's not winning any awards for taste, but when the nearest farm-to-table restaurant is several centuries away, you make do. And yes, this culinary delight is washed down with a swig of weak ale. It's not just because the Vikings were party animals, though they did know how to throw a feast, but because ale was safer to drink than water back then. If you're harboring fantasies of a leisurely seafaring life, you might want to adjust those expectations. Speaking of fantasies, let's burst the bubble of the laid-back Viking sailor myth. Life on a longship is anything but a pleasure cruise. You're not lounging about, soaking up the sun, or lazily fishing off the side. Nope, it's all hands on deck, literally. You're pulling oars, hoisting sails, and constantly battling the elements. The Norsemen built these ships for speed and agility, not comfort. They could cover up to 100 miles in a day if the wind was in their favor, but that meant rowing like your life depended on it, because it often did. The famous Viking longships, or drakar, were marvels of engineering for their time, designed to navigate both the open sea and shallow rivers. Their shallow drafts meant they could be beached easily, perfect for quick raids and even quicker getaways. But that versatility came at a price: stability. On a rough day, you'd feel every swell and wave like a punch to the gut. Seasickness wasn't just a possibility, it was practically a guarantee. And with no privacy, your misery was shared by all. You might be wondering why anyone would willingly subject themselves to such harsh conditions. Well, the allure of the sea was powerful. For Norse society, it was about more than just survival. It was about wealth, exploration, and reputation. Vikings were traders, explorers, and yes, sometimes raiders. They reached as far as North America, the Middle East, and North Africa, long before Columbus ever got his bearings. The sea was the highway to opportunity, and a longship was your ticket. Let's not forget the social dynamics at play. Aboard this ship, you're part of a tight-knit crew, a brotherhood bound by both necessity and ambition. You're not just fighting the elements, you're competing for status and honor. The Viking Age was as much about individual prowess as it was about collective effort. Being part of a successful raid or trade expedition could elevate your standing back home, maybe even win you a share of the loot. And who doesn't want to return home as the hero, laden with exotic goods and tales of distant lands? But let's ground ourselves back in the daily grind. The creaking wood and chill of the sea air are constant reminders that this life is not for the faint-hearted. You're living at the mercy of the elements, with the ever-present risk of storms. Those romantic images of Vikings laughing in the face of danger. Well, sure, but they were also pragmatists who knew the sea could be a cruel mistress. By now, the sun is fully up, casting a golden hue over the restless sea, and you're getting into the rhythm of the day. Row, eat, and repeat. It's a relentless cycle, punctuated by the occasional command barked out by the helmsman or the sighting of another ship on the horizon. Your muscles ache, your stomach grumbles, and your mind wanders. But amidst the discomfort and monotony, there's a strange sense of camaraderie and purpose. As the day unfolds, it's clear that life on a Viking ship is a test of endurance, both physical and mental. You've got to be tough, resourceful, and maybe a little bit mad to thrive in this world. But then again, that's what makes the Vikings such enduring legends, isn't it? They were larger-than-life figures who embraced the chaos and uncertainty of their time, carving out a legacy that still captures our imagination today. So, while you might not last a day on a Viking longship, it's easy to see why these seafaring adventurers are still celebrated as the ultimate badasses of history. Speaking of enduring legends, let's dive into the gritty reality that kept these legends afloat: economics. You might think the Vikings were all about swinging axes and shouting "Scowl" over a horn of ale, but there was more to their seafaring antics than just a thirst for adventure. Behind every great Viking raid or trade mission was a ledger sheet groaning under the weight of costs and calculations. After all, plundering the coasts of Europe wasn't just a pastime, it was an economic necessity. First up, let's talk shipbuilding. Forget IKEA flat packs. Building a longship was a labor of love, sweat, and an eye-watering one, 000 man-hours. That's right, crafting one of these wooden beasts wasn't a weekend project. You needed skilled artisans, precise engineering, and a lot of patience. But why pour so much effort into these vessels? Well, these longships were the Vikings' golden tickets to a world of economic opportunity, both legally and otherwise. Now, you might be wondering what drove these Norse warriors to leave their fjord-riddled homelands in the first place. The answer is as old as time: resources. Scandinavia was a land of rugged beauty, but its harsh climate and limited arable land meant that farmers often scraped by with just enough to survive. This economic pressure cooker pushed many to seek their fortunes overseas, and so the longship became not just a vehicle for travel, but a lifeline to wealth and survival. Raiding was one way to make a living, but it wasn't all about burning monasteries and looting gold. The Vikings were savvy traders, too, dealing in everything from furs to slaves. Their ships would return laden with goods that could be sold or bartered for necessities back home. Trading routes stretched from the windswept coasts of North America to the bustling markets of Baghdad, making the Vikings not just warriors of the sea, but merchants of the world. But before you romanticize these seafaring entrepreneurs, let's not forget the social hierarchy that dictated life aboard the ship. Not every Viking on deck was equal. At the top of the food chain sat the chieftain or captain, the big cheese who called the shots and reaped the lion's share of the bounty. Then came the seasoned warriors, the ones with the best gear and the most scars to show for it. Finally, there were the young, green recruits. Think of them as the interns of the Viking world. They rode the hardest and fought the fiercest, all for a smaller slice of the pie. This hierarchy was more than just a matter of rank. It was an economic necessity. The promise of plunder or profit was the glue that held these crews together. The captain needed to reward his warriors to ensure loyalty and motivation. Fail to deliver, and you'd have a mutiny on your hands faster than you could say Valhalla. Success, however, meant glory and wealth for everyone, or at least for those at the top. Speaking of wealth, the Vikings weren't just in it for the shiny trinkets. Loot they acquired was often reinvested back home. Silver wasn't just for showing off. It was melted down into ingots and used as currency. Wealthier Vikings might use their gains to commission more ships, expand their land holdings, or fund further expeditions. This cycle of investment kept the wheels of Viking society turning and their longships sailing. Now, let's talk about one of the biggest myths surrounding the Vikings: the idea that they were wild, lawless marauders. Sure, there were no shortage of raids, but Viking society was underpinned by a complex system of laws and alliances. These raiding parties were often sanctioned by local chieftains or kings who took their cut of the spoils. It was a business transaction as much as a bloodthirsty adventure. And with all this talk of wealth and hierarchy, let's not forget the driving force behind these epic voyages: reputation. In Norse culture, your name was your legacy. Returning with tales of distant lands and exotic goods was a surefire way to elevate your status. A successful expedition could mean the difference between being remembered as a hero or forgotten as a footnote in the sagas. So, as you struggle to keep your balance on the swaying deck, try to imagine the economic engine powering this floating horde. From the staggering costs of shipbuilding to the carefully orchestrated raids and trades, the Vikings were masters of making the most out of what they had. It was a tough, brutal existence, but one that offered the promise of glory and wealth to those daring enough to seize it. As the day wears on and the sun begins its slow descent, you realize that life on a Viking longship is a relentless dance of survival, ambition, and economics. With every pull of the oar and every gust of wind-filled sail, you're not just battling the elements, but navigating the complex web of social and economic forces that define your world. And while you might not last a day in these rugged conditions, it's easy to see why the Vikings' legendary exploits continue to capture our imagination, blending romance and reality in a saga that endures through the ages. As your Viking longship carves through the sea like a Norse guard's chariot, let's steer into the choppy waters of Viking reality versus romance. By mid-morning, the sun is blazing high, casting sharp shadows that remind you of the equally stark truths about Viking life. Sure, we've got the epic sagas and tales of raiding glory, but beneath the bravado lurked complex political and social dynamics that could make or break a voyage. First off, let's tackle the notion that Vikings were just helmeted hooligans with a penchant for pillaging. The truth, they were strategic masterminds. Take their navigation skills, for instance. We're not talking about wandering aimlessly with the wind. These guys were the GPS of the medieval world. Using tools like the sun compass and the cunning sunstone, they could pinpoint their location even under the perpetual cloud cover of the North Atlantic. These were more than mere raiders. They were seasoned seafarers who understood that a successful voyage required more than brute force. And what about those raids? They weren't just spur-of-the-moment smash-and-grab jobs. Viking raids were meticulously planned military operations. Imagine a boardroom filled with Norse chieftains plotting the most efficient routes, identifying the juiciest targets, and timing their attacks for maximum impact. In fact, the infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD wasn't just a random act of violence, but a calculated strike that marked the start of the Viking Age. This wasn't chaos. This was strategy at its finest. But let's not gloss over why these raids were so perilous. Aside from the obvious risks of seafaring, political alliances were as fluid as the waters they sailed. The Vikings were often caught in the crosshairs of local power struggles, and aligning with the wrong faction could spell disaster. The shifting sands of European politics meant that today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy, and navigating these treacherous waters required as much skill as steering through the stormy North Sea. Now, speaking of alliances, the Vikings weren't just conquering warriors. They were shrewd diplomats. They forged alliances with local rulers, often through marriage, trade, or the simple yet effective currency of intimidation. These alliances weren't just for show. They were essential to securing safe passage, gathering intelligence, and ensuring that the spoils of war were safely transported back home. Even the infamous Viking leader Rollo, who settled in what's now Normandy, secured his position by agreeing to protect the French coast in exchange for land and titles. It was diplomacy, Viking style. Moving on to the social fabric on board these ships, it wasn't all about who could swing an axe the hardest. Norse society was deeply hierarchical, and social status was everything. A successful raid could elevate a common warrior to the rank of nobility, a tantalizing prospect for anyone crammed into a longship with dreams of glory. Yet, this quest for status often led to rivalries and conflicts within the crew, adding another layer of danger to these expeditions. You weren't just fighting foreign foes. You were competing against the guy rowing next to you for a slice of the glory pie. And we can't ignore the role of Norse mythology in shaping the Viking worldview. These tales weren't just bedtime stories. They were the moral framework guiding their lives. The sagas spoke of gods like Odin, who hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil to gain wisdom, or Thor, whose hammer-wielding exploits embodied strength and protection. These myths justified their actions and inspired them to emulate the gods' bravery and cunning. But beyond the legends lay a pragmatic philosophy. Life was a series of battles, both literal and metaphorical, and only the strongest survived. This worldview influenced not just individual behavior, but also larger societal trends. The concept of weird, or fate, played a significant role, suggesting that while the gods might set the stage, it was up to the Vikings to perform their parts with courage and determination. This belief in destiny, coupled with a healthy dose of self-determination, created a culture that was both fiercely independent and deeply communal. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant negotiation between personal ambition and collective responsibility. Now, before you start thinking it was all epic feasts and glorious battles, remember the stark realities. The life of a Viking warrior was brutal and short. Many never returned from their voyages, falling victim to storms, disease, or the sharp end of a rival's sword. Those who did make it back faced the constant threat of feuds and vendettas, a reminder that even on land, life was as perilous as at sea. And yet, despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, the Vikings carved out a legacy that defies the passage of time. They were more than marauders. They were explorers, traders, and cultural catalysts who left an indelible mark on the world. Their stories, a mix of myth and reality, continue to capture our imagination, offering a glimpse into a world where the line between legend and life was as blurred as the horizon on a misty morning at sea. As the sun climbs higher, casting its unrelenting glare on the open water, you realize that life on a Viking longship was a crucible of endurance, ambition, and societal interplay. Yet, it's this very complexity that makes the Vikings so fascinating. They weren't just characters in a saga. They were real people navigating a world as unpredictable as the seas they sailed. And while you might not last a day in their boots, or rather, their fur-lined shoes, it's easy to see why their tales of adventure and adversity continue to resonate, echoing across the centuries like the haunting call of a distant ship horn. As the sun blazes its way across the sky, you find yourself grappling with the practical side of Viking seafaring, where romance meets reality in a head-on collision worthy of its own saga. Forget the Hollywood glamour of windswept warriors standing heroically at the bow. The gritty truth, keeping a Viking longship afloat, was a constant battle against the elements, entropy, and the occasional rogue wave that seemed to have it out for you personally. First off, maintaining these wooden marvels was no small feat. These longships were built primarily from oak, prized for its strength and flexibility, but that didn't make them immune to the relentless assault of salt water and weather. The constant exposure to the briny deep meant that every plank and nail was under siege, slowly but surely succumbing to the creeping fingers of rot and corrosion. It wasn't uncommon for repairs to be carried out mid-voyage, with crew members scrambling to patch leaks faster than you could say, Ragnarok. Speaking of repairs, the Vikings didn't exactly have the luxury of pulling into the nearest marina for a quick fix. Oh no, these guys were the ultimate DIY champions of their era. You'd find them hacking together makeshift solutions with whatever materials were on hand. Sails needed constant care too, often woven from wool or linen, which made them vulnerable to the elements. Sailmakers on board were as critical as the warriors themselves, tasked with ensuring the ship didn't end up as just another piece of driftwood. Now, let's talk about navigation. No Google Maps here, folks. The Vikings were the original marine mavericks, relying on the sun, stars, and even migratory birds to guide their way. Ever heard of a sunstone? It's not some mythical artifact Indiana Jones would hunt for, but rather a piece of calcite crystal that could polarize sunlight and help determine the sun's position even on overcast days. It's like having an ancient solar-powered GPS, minus the battery life issues. These navigational skills were crucial, especially when you consider the distances these ships covered. A typical voyage could stretch anywhere from a couple of 100 miles to over 1,000, with the longest recorded journey being Leif Erikson's leap to North America around the year 1000 AD. To put this into perspective, that's like driving from New York to Miami, but without pit stops, roadside diners, or the option to turn up the air conditioning. As for the social structure on board, it was more rigid than a frozen fjord. The hierarchy was clear. At the top, you had the helmsman, a seasoned veteran whose word was law. Beneath him were the older warriors, respected for their experience and battle scars. At the bottom, the young bloods, eager and expendable, who took on the dirtiest jobs and hoped to rise through the ranks. This hierarchy wasn't just for show. It was essential for maintaining order in the cramped, high-stress environment of a longship. Disputes were settled swiftly, often with a sharp word or a sharper sword. In such tight quarters, personal space was as mythical as a unicorn, and patience was more valuable than the finest silver. A disciplined crew was the backbone of any successful voyage, ensuring that everyone knew their role and, more importantly, stuck to it. But let's not kid ourselves that everything was shipshape and Bristol fashion. The constant proximity bred tension, and tempers could flare over the smallest slight. With nowhere to escape, conflicts had to be resolved quickly, sometimes with a fist, other times with a more diplomatic approach, like a shared swig of ale or a hearty laugh at the expense of a mutual foe. After all, nothing bonds like shared suffering and the occasional existential crisis at sea. Camaraderie was crucial, but it was also a survival strategy. The Vikings knew that every man needed to pull his weight, quite literally, to ensure the survival of the whole crew. This wasn't just about personal honor. It was about collective survival in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. If someone slacked off, it wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It could be the difference between life and death. And let's not forget the unforgiving mistress that was the North Sea. With waves that could swallow a ship whole and winds that could strip sails faster than a winter storm, navigating these waters demanded respect and skill in equal measure. It was a game of constant vigilance, where the stakes were as high as the waves themselves. In this world, the Vikings were both heroes and pragmatists, willing to risk everything for the promise of wealth and fame. Yet they were also realists who knew that their fate was as unpredictable as the sea. They were bound by a code that valued strength, loyalty, and the kind of audacity that turned the impossible into the legendary. So, as the afternoon stretches on, and you find yourself pondering the logistics of Viking life, it's clear that these seafaring adventurers were more than the sum of their raids and conquests. They were masters of their environment, innovators in their own right, and navigators of both the seas and the complex social hierarchies that defined their world. They're a testament to human resilience, ambition, and the undying spirit of exploration that drives us all to seek out new horizons, even when the journey is fraught with peril. As the sun casts long shadows over the restless water, you begin to appreciate the sheer tenacity required to survive, let alone thrive, in this world of wooden ships and iron wills. While you might not last a day in their world, the legacy of the Vikings is a reminder that history is not just about the battles fought or the lands conquered, but about the enduring human spirit that pushes us to venture beyond the horizon, no matter what challenges lie in wait. But let's face it, while the Vikings' tenacity is the stuff of legends, the reality of their seafaring life is a deal-breaker for most modern-day adventurers. Sure, the idea of sailing into the sunset, hair blowing in the wind, is the stuff of epic sagas, but try spending a day in the confines of a longship, and you'll quickly realize the romance is more of a ruse. The truth is, your average 21st century comfort seeker would tap out faster than you can say, Valhalla. Let's start with the basics, hygiene, or rather, the severe lack thereof. On a Viking longship, the concept of personal space was as foreign as a smartphone. When you're crammed onto a vessel with up to 60 other men, all sharing the same few square feet, any semblance of personal grooming goes out the window. Bathing was a rare luxury, and the smell, well, let's just say the North Sea breeze would occasionally offer some respite from the olfactory assault of unwashed bodies and dried fish. Moving on to sustenance, or the lack thereof. As we mentioned before, your diet would consist mainly of dried fish and weak ale. It's not exactly the gourmet experience you might crave after a hard day's rowing, and that's if the supply held out. In the event of a longer voyage or an unforeseen delay, rationing became a grim reality. Picture it. You're already exhausted from rowing for hours, and now you have to share your meager rations with your equally famished crewmates. Talk about a crash diet. And then there's the sleep, or rather, the futile attempt at it. With no cabins or bunks, you'd be lucky to catch a few hours of shut-eye on the hard wooden deck, wrapped in a damp cloak. The constant motion of the ship, coupled with the symphony of snoring warriors and the ever-present threat of capsizing, meant that a restful night's sleep was as elusive as a Norse god's favor. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that made life aboard a Viking longship so demanding. The mental strain was equally taxing. Each journey was fraught with uncertainty. Storms could appear seemingly out of nowhere, rival ships could be lurking just beyond the horizon, and the ever-present risk of mutiny loomed. In an environment where leadership was paramount, maintaining morale and ensuring cooperation was a delicate balancing act. The chieftain needed to be both a strategic mastermind and a skilled diplomat, capable of quelling discontent before it boiled over into full-blown rebellion. Despite these harsh realities, The Viking Age continues to captivate our imaginations, and not just because of their fearsome reputation. Their resilience, adaptability, and sheer audacity have left an indelible mark on history. Take their journeys, for instance. They didn't just sail aimlessly. They ventured as far as North America, centuries before Columbus, and established trade routes that spanned from the icy shores of Newfoundland to the bustling bazaars of Baghdad. These voyages weren't just about raiding. They were about connecting disparate cultures and spreading ideas, innovations, and yes, occasionally plundering a monastery or two for good measure. Speaking of cultural impact, the Viking legacy extends far beyond their seafaring exploits. Consider the influence of Norse mythology, which continues to permeate modern culture. From Marvel's Thor to the epic tales chronicled in video games and TV series, the pantheon of Norse gods and their legendary exploits have captured the collective imagination. This isn't just folklore. It's a testament to the enduring power of storytelling and the human desire to find meaning in myths. And let's not overlook the Vikings' contributions to language. Many English words have their roots in Old Norse, thanks to the Norsemen's interactions with the Anglo-Saxons. Words like berserk, ransack, and skull all owe their origins to the Vikings, a linguistic legacy that hints at their colorful and often tumultuous past. Economically, the Vikings were far more than marauders. Their sophisticated trade networks and keen eye for commerce laid the groundwork for the development of thriving medieval markets. The loom of Viking commerce stretched across Europe, fostering an exchange of goods and ideas that would shape the continent's economic landscape for centuries to come. In many ways, they were the forerunners of globalization, connecting distant lands through trade and exploration. So what can we learn from the Vikings today? Their adaptability and resilience in the face of adversity are as relevant now as they were a millennium ago. In a world where change is the only constant, the ability to navigate uncertainty with tenacity and ingenuity is a skill worth emulating. The Vikings taught us that with a little grit and a lot of courage, even the most daunting challenges can be transformed into opportunities. As the sun dips below the horizon and the day aboard the Viking longship draws to a close, you're left with a newfound appreciation for the enduring legacy of these seafaring adventurers. While the romantic allure of the Viking Age is undeniable, it's the gritty reality of their existence that truly defines them. They were not just fearsome warriors, but pioneers who dared to venture beyond the known world, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire and captivate. So, as you step back onto dry land, perhaps you'll carry with you a little of the Viking spirit, an appreciation for the boldness to explore, the courage to face the unknown, and the wisdom to embrace both the romance and the reality of life. Because while you might not last a day on a Viking longship, the lessons of resilience, adaptability, and audacity are timeless. If you've ever thought your morning commute was a drag, spare a thought for the Crusaders heading off to the siege of Acre in the late 12th century. Forget about rush hour traffic or delayed trains. These folks embarked on a journey that could take years, all while dodging more perils than an episode of a medieval reality show. Picture this. You're a knight, a peasant, or maybe somewhere in between, and you've got a one-way ticket to the Holy Land. But before you even set foot on this sacred soil, or sand, more like, you've got to navigate the geopolitical maze that was the 12th century. Let's set the stage. It's 1189, and the Crusader states in the Middle East are feeling the heat after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin just a couple of years earlier. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had managed to put together a coalition of Muslim forces that made the European rulers look like squabbling siblings fighting over the last slice of pizza. Enter the Crusaders, spurred by a cocktail of piety, the promise of adventure, and not-so-subtle nudges from the Pope. It's like a spiritual frat party, where the cover charge is your life savings and the dress code is chainmail. The major players lining up for this high-stakes game of Risk included King Richard, the Lionheart of England, who was less interested in ruling England and more intrigued by the prospect of carving out a chunk of the Middle East. His buddy, or rival, depending on the day, was King Philip Roman II of France, a man perpetually looking for an excuse to outshine his Plantagenet counterpart. And let's not forget Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, whose name alone sounds like a heavy metal band. He had a grand plan to lead his forces to Acre, but spoiler alert, he didn't quite make it, thanks to a rather unfortunate drowning incident. Talk about a plot twist. Now, before you could even dream of joining this international coalition, you needed cash. Lots of it. Being a crusader wasn't for the faint of wallet. You couldn't just start a GoFundMe page. Instead, you had to mortgage your land, sell off the family silver, or squeeze your peasants for extra taxes. Historical records suggest that knights often had to spend up to 5 times their annual income just to kit themselves out and fund the journey. And let's be real, those shiny suits of armor and well-fed horses didn't come cheap. It's like splurging on a luxury car today, except this one comes with a high risk of being impaled on a spear. Once you'd scraped together enough gold, it was time to set sail, or march, depending on your starting point. If you were lucky enough to be part of Richard's crew, you might embark from England, sailing the high seas, dealing with seasickness, and praying your ship didn't end up like a medieval Titanic. On land, it was no picnic either. Imagine trudging across Europe, covering hundreds of miles, avoiding bandits, and keeping your eye out for the next village that might offer a warm bed and a heart meal. Think of it as an extreme medieval version of couch surfing, with the added risk of disease and dehydration. Crossing Europe was the medieval equivalent of running a gauntlet. The logistics alone could make your head spin. For instance, Richard's forces were said to have included around 17,000 men. Now, imagine trying to coordinate that many people, horses, and supplies without Google Maps. And let's not overlook the languages and cultures you'd encounter along the way. You'd need the diplomacy skills of a seasoned politician just to negotiate passage through foreign lands. If you thought parallel parking was stressful, try navigating a caravan of knights and soldiers through the Byzantine Empire. Speaking of the Byzantine Empire, they weren't exactly jazzed about the Crusaders marching through their territory. Emperor Isaac Roman II and Gilos had nightmares of these Westerners eating his empire for breakfast. He played a delicate game of diplomacy, trying to keep the peace while secretly hoping the Crusaders would just move along without causing too much chaos. It was like hosting a rowdy bachelor party in your neighborhood and hoping the noise complaints don't get you evicted. As you plodded along, there was a constant undercurrent of tension. Sure, Crusaders were united under the banner of reclaiming the Holy Land, but that didn't mean they saw eye to eye. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, with leaders jostling for prestige and power. Who would get the glory? Who would win the favor of the Pope? Who would end up with the best stories to tell at the medieval equivalent of a cocktail party? These were the burning questions that added fuel to the fire. Then there was the little matter of survival. Disease was a constant companion, with dysentery and scurvy often claiming more lives than actual combat. Clean water was rarer than a unicorn siding, and your diet consisted of hardtack and whatever you could scrounge along the way. Not exactly a Michelin star experience. But hey, at least you didn't have to worry about counting carbs. By the time you reached the outskirts of Acre, you were probably a little worse for wear. Months of travel had worn you down, but the sight of the city brought a renewed sense of purpose. Acre was the key to the kingdom, the gateway to reclaiming Jerusalem, and the symbol of everything you'd sacrificed for. It was time to lay siege, but first, you needed to set up camp, sharpen your swords, and brace yourself for a battle that would test your every limit. And so, as you stand there, looking out over the walls of Acre, with the sea breeze in your hair and the taste of salt on your lips, you realize that you're part of something bigger than yourself. It's a moment steeped in history, full of promise and peril, and you're right in the thick of it. The siege of Acre wasn't just a military campaign. It was a microcosm of the medieval world, with all its glory and grime laid bare. But don't get too comfortable. The story's just beginning, and the real challenges are yet to come. So, there you are, standing on the brink of history, facing the imposing walls of Acre. You're part of a massive siege that's not just about swords and strategy, but also about surviving the less glamorous aspects of medieval warfare. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of your daily grind, starting with what's on the menu. And spoiler alert, it's not exactly a medieval buffet. Think of your diet as the medieval version of a crash course in survival. Hardtack, that delightful slab of baked flour and water, is your staple. It's about as appetizing as a brick, but hey, it doesn't spoil easily, and you can always pretend it's something more exotic. Just make sure to dunk it in water or broth first, unless you fancy chipping a tooth. For protein, you've got salted meat, which raises the question, what kind of meat? Let's just say if there's a medieval equivalent of mystery meat, this is it. You might be gnawing on beef, or it could be something your imaginative palate prefers not to identify. And when supplies run low, desperate times call for desperate measures. Think rats and whatever else you can scavenge. Bon appetit. Now, let's talk about the fine art of hygiene, or lack thereof. If you're picturing a medieval spa day, think again. Bathing is a luxury, not a routine, so you're getting up close and personal with your own, shall we say, aroma. The truth is, soap is rare, and water's often too precious to waste on personal cleanliness. And don't even get me started on the latrines. Suffice it to say, they're more a trench in the ground than a throne fit for royalty. Disease is your constant companion, lurking around every corner, ready to pounce. Dysentery, cholera, and typhus are all eager to make your acquaintance, and they're far deadlier than your average Saracen warrior. But fear not, medieval ingenuity comes to the rescue with some rather creative solutions. You might find yourself rubbing aromatic herbs on your skin to mask odors, or hanging garlic around your neck, hoping to ward off illness. The latter might not win you any friends, but hey, desperate times. And then there's the good old-fashioned belief in the healing power of relics. If you can get your hands on a saint's bone, or a sliver of the true cross, you might just believe you've got a divine shield against the ailments of the day. In between all these delightful challenges, you're also keeping an eye on the enemy. Saladin's forces are no pushovers, and they're not about to hand over Acre without a fight. Siege warfare is a game of patience as much as power, and you're in it for the long haul. Keeping morale high is crucial, so stories of heroism, divine intervention, and the occasional miracle circulate like medieval memes. Who needs Netflix when you've got the Crusader campfire tales? Speaking of morale, let's not ignore the economics of this whole ordeal. War is expensive, and as a Crusader, you're probably feeling the pinch. Remember, you've already sold half your possessions just to get here. Now, you're relying on supply lines that are as unpredictable as the English weather. King Richard and his counterparts are juggling finances, trying to keep the coin flowing to pay the soldiers, bribe local allies, and procure supplies. Inflation is a real concern, with the price of grain and other essentials skyrocketing as the siege drags on. If you're a common foot soldier, you're not seeing much of that coin, and bartering becomes your new best friend. Let's not forget the political drama that's unfolding alongside the military one. Richard and Philip, those frenemies we talked about earlier, are still at it. Richard's charisma and martial prowess make him a natural leader, but Philip has the home advantage, with closer ties to the land. Their rivalry is like a medieval soap opera, full of intrigue and backstabbing. Add the Byzantine Empire's cautious diplomacy to the mix, and you've got a geopolitical stew bubbling with tension. As the siege progresses, you're not just fighting for territory, but for survival. Every day is a balancing act between maintaining the siege and keeping the camp running. The Crusader camp is a microcosm of medieval society, complete with its own hierarchy, from the noble knights to the foot soldiers and camp followers. Each group has its own role, and maintaining that structure is crucial to the operation's success. So, as you stand on the front lines, with the sun setting over the Mediterranean and the walls of Acre looming in the distance, you realize that every moment is a test of endurance, faith, and cunning. The siege isn't just about who has the bigger army or who can outlast whom. It's about navigating the complexities of medieval life with all its trials and triumphs. But don't get too comfortable. There's plenty more adventure ahead, and the sands of history are still shifting beneath your feet. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the Mediterranean, you're reminded that this siege isn't just about brawn or bravery. It's a chess game played with catapults and crossbows, and the stakes are as high as your cholesterol after months of salted meat. Let's dive into the Crusaders' playbook and see how they aim to crack open Acre like an overripe medieval piñata. First off, let's talk siege engines, essentially the medieval equivalent of today's military drones. Siege towers, trebuchets, and mangonels sounds like a law firm, right? Were the showstoppers of medieval warfare. These towering behemoths weren't just haphazardly thrown together. They were feats of engineering that even Da Vinci would have admired. A siege tower could stand up to 100 feet tall, towering over the battlefield like a wooden skyscraper. while a well-aimed trebuchet could launch a 300-pound stone over 300 yards. It was like the Super Bowl halftime show, but with way more splinters and fewer pyrotechnics. Building these monstrosities required serious resources. Timber was worth its weight in gold, or more accurately, in the local currency of Venetian ducats, which were the Bitcoin of the medieval world. Trees were sourced from miles away, cut down, and transported with the kind of logistical precision that would make Amazon prime blush. Constructing a single siege tower could take weeks and hundreds of laborers, not to mention the constant threat of a surprise Saladin attack putting a damper on your carpentry plans. Once these siege engines were up and running, it was showtime. The plan was simple. Get close enough to the city walls to either smash them down or provide a platform for soldiers to storm across. Easy enough, right? Except for the small detail of enemy archers, boiling oil, and the occasional hurled beehive. Yes, beehives. Forget drones. Try dealing with a swarm of angry bees when you're already knee-deep in chaos. But that's not all. When your wooden towers and stone-flinging trebuchets weren't doing the trick, it was time to go underground, literally. Enter the infamous tunnel-digging escapades. Mining, as it was called, involved digging tunnels under the city walls to either collapse them or sneak troops inside. It was a dirty, dangerous job usually given to experienced miners from places like Cornwall or the Rhineland. Imagine working in pitch darkness, with the constant threat of tunnel collapse or the enemy digging a counter-tunnel to meet you halfway with swords instead of handshakes. And then there was the psychological warfare. Forget about Twitter spats or passive-aggressive emails. This was a whole other level. Both sides engaged in a game of mental chess, trying to outwit and demoralize each other. The Crusaders would chant prayers and sing hymns loud enough to reach the defenders' ears, reminding them of the divine righteousness of their cause. Meanwhile, Saladin's troops would counter with their own calls to prayer, creating a cacophony that made sleep as elusive as an honest medieval merchant. Legends abound of miraculous visions and divine signs seen in the skies above Acre, meant to bolster the spirits of weary soldiers. Whether it was a heavenly apparition or just a trick of the light, these tales spread like wildfire through the camp, turning skepticism into renewed zeal. But before you get swept up in the romance, remember that these stories often served as medieval spin tactics, boosting morale when reality was as grim as a muddy trench after a rainstorm. And what about the legends of chivalry and noble duels? Romantic, yes, but the truth was far grittier. Knights were indeed the rock stars of their day, but the battlefield was less about gallant one-on-one combats and more about chaotic melees where survival often depended on luck as much as skill. Forget about the polished armor and gleaming swords of Hollywood. Think sweat, grime, and the constant fear of catching a stray arrow with your face. Speaking of arrows, let's not overlook the role of ranged warfare. Crossbows and longbows were the medieval sniper rifles, capable of taking out opponents from a safe distance. A skilled longbowman could fire up to 12 arrows per minute, turning the sky into a deadly hailstorm. While the romantic notion of knights charging heroically into battle captures our imagination, it was often the anonymous archers and foot soldiers who turned the tide of battle, their efforts less celebrated, but no less critical. In the midst of this organized chaos, the economic realities couldn't be ignored. Siege warfare was an expensive business, and the longer it dragged on, the more the coffers drained. Richard the Lionheart was known for his extravagance, but even he had to keep tabs on the budget. Supply lines were the lifeblood of the siege, bringing in everything from grain to fresh horses, and keeping those lines open was as crucial as any battle plan. Inflation was rampant, with prices for essentials like food and fodder skyrocketing, turning even the most basic provisions into luxury items. And let's not forget the political undercurrents at play. The Crusader camp was a melting pot of different nationalities and cultures, each with its own agenda. Leaders like Richard and Philip had to navigate these treacherous waters, balancing personal ambition with the collective goal of capturing Acre. Diplomacy was as vital as swordplay, with alliances shifting like the sands beneath the city walls. As the siege dragged on, the Crusaders found themselves in a high-stakes game of endurance, where every day brought new challenges and new opportunities for heroism or disaster. The walls of Acre stood as a testament to both the might of its defenders and the relentless determination of its besiegers. With each passing day, the tension mounted, the stakes rose, and the outcome remained uncertain. So, as you stand there, surrounded by the clamor of the siege engines and the distant cries of soldiers, you can feel the weight of history pressing down. This is more than just a battle for a city. It's a struggle for survival, identity, and a place in the annals of time. The siege of Acre is far from over, and as the sun sets on another day of blood, sweat, and medieval ingenuity, you know the story is only just beginning. Stay tuned. There's plenty more medieval madness to come. Buckle up, because now we're diving headfirst into the political merry-go-round that was the siege of Acre. If you thought medieval warfare was all about swords and catapults, think again. Behind the clashing steel and flying arrows, there was a chessboard of diplomacy and deceit that would make Machiavelli tip his hat. This wasn't just a siege. It was a medieval soap opera with plot twists that'd leave even the most jaded Game of Thrones fan gasping. Let's kick things off by spotlighting Richard the Lionheart, the rock star of the Crusader lineup. Picture a man with more charisma than a reality TV contest winner and martial prowess to boot. Richard wasn't just a king, he was a brand. His presence alone was a morale booster for the Crusaders, like a medieval Red Bull. But here's where it gets juicy. Richard's relationship with King Philip II of France, his supposed ally, was more complicated than a Facebook relationship status. These two were frenemies before the term was even invented. Philip was always eyeing Richard's moves, like a hawk sizing up a rival hawk at the top of a very precarious tree. Now, you'd think these two would focus solely on the siege, right? Wrong. They were constantly engaged in a geopolitical chess match, often more concerned with outmaneuvering each other than the actual enemy. Richard was the flamboyant warrior, while Philip played the shrewd strategist. It was a classic case of brawn versus brains, and neither wanted to be the supporting act in this Crusader concert. Then there's Saladin, the enigmatic sultan who was the rock in the Crusaders' shoe. Saladin was no slouch when it came to politics either. He knew the Crusaders' weaknesses and exploited them with the finesse of a master tactician. He wasn't just defending Acre. He was playing the long game, ensuring his coalition of Muslim forces remained united and strong. Saladin's diplomacy was as sharp as his sword, and he knew how to use both to devastating effect. Now, add to this mix the Byzantine Empire, which was playing a game of let's see how long we can stay neutral without actually helping. Emperor Isaac Roman II Angelos was walking a tightrope, trying to keep the Western Crusaders at bay while also fending off Saladin's advances. The Byzantines were the wild card in this medieval deck, a reminder that in politics, as in poker, sometimes the best hand is the one you don't play. Speaking of cards, let's not forget the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, who had planned to join the crusade but took an unexpected dip in the Salef River, leaving his forces leaderless. This sudden plot twist left a power vacuum and a whole lot of German knights wondering what to do next. It was like the lead actor in a play dropping out on opening night, leaving the understudies scrambling to pick up the pieces. Back at the siege, the Crusader camp was a melting pot of nationalities, each with its own ambitions and agendas. It was like a medieval United Nations, minus the peacekeeping. The Italians wanted trade routes, the French sought glory, and the English longed for a legacy. Each faction was convinced their goals were the most crucial, and keeping everyone on the same page was like herding cats through a field of catnip. In this chaotic swirl of ambition and intrigue, alliances were as fragile as a soap bubble. Betrayals were common currency, traded as easily as a sack of grain. Richard and Philip's partnership was constantly teetering on the edge of collapse, with each accusing the other of undermining their authority. It was like watching a reality show where everyone's vying for the title of most treacherous. And just when you thought it couldn't get any more tangled, throw in the papal influence. The Pope was the ultimate puppet master, pulling strings from afar, issuing decrees like a medieval CEO. His support was crucial, but it came at a price. The Crusaders had to balance their earthly ambitions with spiritual obligations, a juggling act that would make even the most seasoned circus performer break a sweat. As the siege dragged on, the costs, both financial and human, were mounting. Richard's war chest was bleeding gold faster than a leaky barrel, with the siege draining resources quicker than a medieval tax collector. Inflation ran rampant, with the price of essentials like grain and horses soaring. The economic strain was felt by everyone, from the wealthiest knight to the humblest foot soldier. But it wasn't just money that was in short supply. Patience was wearing thin, too. The longer the siege lasted, the more tempers frayed, and the more likely it became that an internal squabble would explode into full-blown conflict. It was a pressure cooker of tension, with everyone waiting to see who'd crack first. In the midst of this chaos, human stories abounded. There were tales of heroism and cowardice, of knights who performed acts of valor, and those who sought only to save their own skins. The Crusader camp was a microcosm of humanity, with all its triumphs and failings on full display. It was easy to get lost in the drama, to forget that behind every intrigue was a very real battle being fought. So, as the sun rises on another day at the siege of Acre, you're reminded that this isn't just a story of swords and sieges. It's a tale of human ambition and folly, of dreams and desperation. The political machinations that played out here were as crucial to the outcome as any trebuchet or siege tower. In this medieval Game of Thrones, the stakes were nothing less than the fate of the Holy Land itself. Stay tuned, because the sands of history are still shifting, and the story of the siege of Acre is far from over. There's plenty more intrigue, betrayal, and yes, medieval madness to come. And so, the siege of Acre marched on, a relentless juggernaut of ambition and desperation. It was a medieval page-turner, with each day bringing fresh twists in this epic saga of sand, sweat, and swords. But every story must reach its climax, and as the summer of 1191 unfurled its scorching embrace, the tension reached a boiling point harder than a blacksmith's forge. The Crusaders, a ragtag ensemble of knights, foot soldiers, and opportunists, stood poised to breach Acre's walls. Their resolve was as ironclad as their armor, even as their bodies and minds were worn thin by months of grueling siege warfare. Supplies were dwindling, morale was sinking faster than a stone in a moat, and the spectre of failure loomed large. Yet, like a gambler on a losing streak, they were all in. There was no turning back. On July 12, 1191, the crescendo hit. The walls of Acre, battered by months of relentless assault, finally yielded to the Crusaders' unyielding determination. It was a chaotic melee, swords clashing amidst the cries of the dying and the wails of the wounded. The city, a microcosm of medieval society, became a battlefield, with every street corner a potential death trap, every alley a gauntlet of blood and dust. In the aftermath, the Crusaders reveled in their hard-won victory, but the spoils were not as glorious as they might have hoped. Acre was a city in ruins, its riches plundered, its people devastated. The romantic notion of noble conquest was shattered by the grim reality of what it took to achieve it. For the Crusaders, the fall of Acre was both a triumph and a pitic victory, a testament to their resolve and a reminder of the cost of their ambition. As the dust settled, the victors faced the daunting task of holding their prize, a task complicated by the ever-present spectre of political intrigue. Richard the Lionheart, now the de facto leader of the crusade, found himself juggling more balls than a circus performer on a caffeine high. His relationship with Philip Roman II, already strained, continued to unravel like a medieval tapestry caught in a fierce wind. Philip, perhaps tired of the endless bickering, packed his bags and headed home, leaving Richard to deal with the aftermath. Saladin, ever the resilient adversary, regrouped and prepared for the next chapter of this unending conflict. The fall of Acre was a setback, but not a death knell. For him, the loss was a strategic retreat, a temporary blip in the long game of chess he played with the Crusaders. Saladin's legacy endured, his reputation as a leader and tactician unblemished by the loss of a single city. The siege's conclusion rippled far beyond the blood-soaked streets of Acre, altering the course of history like a pebble dropped in a vast pond. For the Crusaders, it was a bittersweet victory that underscored the futility of their endeavor. Despite the fall of Acre, Jerusalem remained elusive, a shimmering mirage on the horizon, always just out of reach. The Holy Land, with its sacred allure, continued to draw adventurers and zealots, but the dream of reclaiming it in its entirety was slipping away like sand through a clenched fist. Economically, the siege drained resources at an alarming rate. The cost of war was astronomical, with Richard spending a king's ransom, quite literally, on supplies, troops, and weaponry. The financial strain echoed back to Europe, where coffers ran dry and taxes mounted, leaving a legacy of debt that would haunt kings and commoners alike. It was a stark reminder that war, while often romanticized, is a brutal business with a bottom line that demands payment in blood and treasure. Yet, amidst the gloom, there was a silver lining. The siege fostered innovations in military strategy and engineering, laying the groundwork for future conflicts. The lessons learned at Acre would echo down the centuries, influencing warfare long after the Crusaders had faded into the annals of history. The siege engines, the tactical maneuvers, and the logistical feats achieved here were milestones in the evolution of medieval warfare, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in an era defined by its limitations. Culturally, the siege left an indelible mark on the Western psyche. The legends of chivalry, the tales of heroism and betrayal became the stuff of myth and folklore, capturing the imaginations of generations to come. Bards and chroniclers, ever eager to embellish the truth, spun narratives that elevated the Crusaders to near-mythical status, conveniently glossing over the less savory aspects of their campaign. The romanticized vision of noble knights and holy quests persisted, despite the gritty reality that lay beneath. And what does the Siege of Acre tell us about the human condition? It reveals our capacity for endurance, our drive to pursue dreams despite overwhelming odds. It shows our penchant for conflict, born out of a complex mix of ambition, faith, and folly. The siege was a microcosm of humanity's eternal struggle between idealism and pragmatism, a dance as timeless as the stars that shone down on Acre's battered walls. As the tale of the Siege of Acre draws to a close, we're left with a tapestry woven from the threads of history, a tapestry that reflects both the grandeur and the grime of medieval life. It's a story of triumph and tragedy, of dreams pursued and lost, of legends born in the crucible of conflict. In the end, the siege stands as a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a living narrative shaped by the people who dared to dream, to fight, and to endure. And so, as you close the book on the Siege of Acre, take a moment to reflect on its legacy. Remember the knights and soldiers, the kings and sultans who played their part in this grand drama. Remember the lessons learned, the myths perpetuated, and the truths uncovered. For in the end, the Siege of Acre is not just a story of the past. It is a mirror reflecting the complexities of the human spirit, a tale that continues to resonate through the ages. With that, dear listener, we bid farewell to the dusty streets and towering walls of Acre. Until next time, may your journey through history be as enlightening as it is entertaining. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the spirit of curiosity alive. Because in the grand tapestry of time, there are always more stories waiting to be told.